And yeah, I'm spending a few years with it, and yeah, I remember, Sharon was sort of disappointed things weren't moving quicker. Unfortunately, this is pretty hairy stuff.
Yes.
You could be spending a long time with it. It's sort of like a gold miner who's working that old mine out in the hills, and you're making a week's wages in a year, and
Yes.
that's the amount of time you're spending for the results you're getting. I'm afraid that's just the way you're going to have to go.
That's just what it
There
takes.
there isn't an easy path unless ChatGPT does it for you, as the rumors are circulating.
A ChatGPT solution will be to just paper over all the complicated parts. That's too messy. Let's just go for the impression. So the paragraph that we're on, which is what Sharon pointed us to, as we were talking last week on the previous paragraph, she did the thing that she does, which I do enjoy, where she kind of shows how what we're talking about connects to what he's going to say in the next paragraph. Now we're in that paragraph, the one she's pointing to. And I spent some time pulling it apart because, man, there's some juicy stuff in here. There's times when Kenneth unpacks his work sufficiently, and there's times when he doesn't. And this is one of the ones where he's not unpacking it enough. So I want to unpack it for us. For those just joining us, this is Millennia Microcosm, work by Kenneth Smith that David and I are collecting into a book that started out as a column in the 1998, 99, 2000 timeframe. It's called End Times, and it was published in the back of the Comics Journal. We're collecting it into a book, which is what Kenneth always meant to have happen to it. We're on week 68, I believe, and we're only on chapter 4 out of a multi-chapter volume. But part of the reason for that is that this book is trying to describe 3 great epochs of history and what the worldview was at each time. So we learn the ability to see the world through these different perspectives. And what Kenneth has done, because he taught Ancient Civ so often, is that rather than giving it 12 chapters, he compressed it into a single chapter. So it takes a long time to unpack this one chapter. It's an epoch worth of material. We're in section F, Mythos and Logos, which is talking about 2 different forms of culture. And it's talking about them because what's interesting about the ancient Greeks is that they began writing down and questioning their own culture and political systems and beliefs while they were still in a mythos culture. And as a result, they ended up inadvertently documenting the transition from a mythos culture to a logos culture, which is what they became later. The philosophers the Greek philosophers who are most famous today are almost all logos philosophers, people like Plato and Socrates and Aristotle. But there'd already been a vast philosophical tradition before that of people who the medievals only preserved fragments of, people like Thales and Anaximander and Democritus. So, the differences between a mythos culture and a logos culture are very instructive for us as moderns. If we're trying to understand what it means to be modern, part of what we have to understand is that from an ancient perspective, we have a hyper logos culture. We're obsessed with measuring things, quantifying things, systematizing things. Sort of many people, even moderns, have speculated that the end game of modernity is that there will be no free will at all. Every person will be 100% bound up by a system of laws that tells them every moment what they're supposed to do next and what they're not supposed to do next. And thus we can remove all the humanity from human beings and just make them little gears in a perfect machine, and thus arrive at the modern utopia. And a lot of us suspect that might not be as nice as as we are supposed to believe it would be, but because we're moderns, every time we attempt to break out of that great march, we end up creating another system that's yet another modernist, mechanistic, hyper logos culture. For example, the Soviet Union was formed in opposition to the capitalist nations of Europe. And it said, well, we're going to solve all the problems of capitalism by being the opposite. We're going to create a communist society that's not capitalist at all, and this will get rid of the vices of capitalism. And yet, when we look back over the subsequent history of the Soviet Union and Russia, first of all, the course of their history ended up bringing them back to capitalism, which is not what they had in mind at all. And you got to ask yourself, how is it that what they set in motion moved in this direction? The other thing being that even before it did that, their ways of organizing society have an enormous amount in common with capitalist ways of organizing society. The metrics of productivity, the use of money, the use of establishing priorities and value, what is to be done and what is not to be done, the way that political arguments took place within the Supreme Soviet, it had the same. Once you contrast it with, say, an indigenous culture or, say, a mythos culture, it really stands out that both Communist Soviet Union and capitalist United States are both hyper-logos cultures, obsessed with numbers, laws, systems, and the mechanization of life. They're basically two sides of the same coin rather than being opposites. And it's telling that in an epoch when people are marinating in the assumptions and worldview of that epoch, even when it is their fundamental goal above all other things to break absolutely out of the rut they're in and create the opposite kind of society, they end up creating the same kind of society, but with different branding. It's being moderns, we're so saturated in logos culture that to us, it's inconceivable how a culture could exist if it weren't a logos culture. So in our attempt to create the opposite of a logos culture, we create another logos culture. And this happens over and over throughout modernity. We sort of can't stop ourselves from doing it because we've become a very one-sided people. So this section is about this struggle between mythos and logos, which you can't illuminate if you look strictly at examples from the modern world, because in the modern world, we've all become hyper-logos cultures. You have to look back at the ancient world and specifically at the earliest evidence we have for the ancient world before they completed their transition into a logos culture themselves, to see what were things like before that. What is the nature of a mythos culture? This paragraph that I've cited above is going to get right into the meat of this. This is what I really want to spend our time on today. There's so much to unpack in these few sentences here. But first, I'll call on Phil because he's got his hand up. Go ahead, man.
Yeah, in some ways it's related to the topic we're in, but I just want to point out something about what you said about Marx that's important. I don't think Marx was trying to deviate from capital. He just wanted the correct capital. So therefore, the fact that everything fell back into sort of a market-driven economy then leads me to the question is that since at least fairly early in civilization, especially when trade already began, we have been involved in a marketing culture. If it is such a fundamental principle that in some sense even transcends politics in the polis, or even transcends maybe even religion, why was there not a philosophy of markets? I mean, instead of a philosophy of thinking. It just seems to me like that's been the undertow of civilization that in a sense has gone along its way and driven culture in some sense, even though there is politics, there is philosophy, there is science, all sorts of things. So that's kind of an interesting question, right? Why wasn't it like, hey man, let's stop talking philosophy. What we're interested in is buying and selling, trading, making profits, all that stuff. It's like, I don't know whether that would have made life better, but I think that's what Marx was saying in terms of criticizing Hegel, right? It's like, no, you got it upside down, right? Let's start from the ground up rather than the top down. All right, so it's just a question. Okay.
Yeah, no, that's famously Marx's argument, right? That's what he says about Hegel. He says he stood Hegel on his feet, implying that Hegel had been standing on his head. Right. And in that, he's criticizing Hegel's attempt to describe the history of mankind as a history of ideas. And he's saying, well, it's not that ideas aren't important, but when someone's pointing a gun at you, other things come to the fore. Rather than the idea, you start paying attention to the serious immediate problem you face. And Marx's argument is that for most people in most times that we know in recorded history, the fundamental threat that they have to pay attention to, or else, is economics. How are they going to make ends meet? Where are they going to get their food from?
I guess the question I have, particularly in America, is that we might have misunderstood Marx because we understood it as Stalinism.
Oh yeah, right.
Or at least Leninism, okay?
Yeah.
Which is about power, and we cast that communism is actually not about capital, but about autocracy versus democracy, which is put in a political dimension, but it still doesn't put it in a philosophical dimension. So in other words, we call it Marxism, but Stalinism is not Marx. Okay, so let's get that part clear. He was trying to say, hey, let's get a little bit more reasonable. I guess he's mixing philosophy and market. Let's get more reasonable about distributing, capital in a way that is, quote, fairer. Okay, and if we understood it that way, we might not be quite as dismissive. We might see it. No, it's really a kind of socialism in a funny way, So we're even against socialism. So we're on the extreme in a funny way. So I just want to say that I guess two things is like Marx in some sense got it right, although I kind of disagree. I kind of believe philosophy is more important than the market, but the market for most people is more important than philosophy. That's it, Phil.
Yeah, I mean, if you can't pay your rent, you become homeless. So modernity has a keen ability to focus the mind on the immediate problem of generating enough revenue to make a living. I need to rent.
Yeah, remember Americans that it's the second most fear thing for Americans is the first is the fear of public speaking. The second is the fear of running out of money before you die.
Yes.
So that is more important than death.
Yes. Thank you, Phil. Joseph, go ahead. What's on your mind?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because what Phil just brought up and the idea of actually thinking about in terms of principles and concepts is that because I think one of the hardest things when it comes to having a theory that's going to help govern an economy is that it's looking at the world very narrowly, like it's only looking at the monetary aspect of things. And it seems like that's the only thing that matters. One of the things that's pretty interesting is that is the inability for people actually to really agree on what is progress. And so when that occurs, like you're kind of, you're up against kind of an impossible question. What are the governing principles of that, right? What's the most important thing to an individual versus a society? It's hard to reconcile those two things. And I think that that's where philosophy on a personal level is able to, you can execute. You can take the principles and live your life by those principles and the concepts. And that's, gives you purpose. But then when you try to raise that to more of a macro level, you can, it becomes a little bit more difficult because there are conflicting interests. So I think that that's where it's sometimes, we're incapable of coming up with a holistic approach to that would really kind of facilitate the idea of progress. So what people do in lieu of that is they focus on monetary policy and how to essentially, ensure that that the monetary system doesn't completely collapse, even though the it still extracts a hell of a lot from people. But I think that that's an important thing to think about, because in terms of when we think of terms of principles and concepts, the other thing, as I'll say, is there is the other side of myth in terms of economics as well, and that is the negative side, is that the self-made individual, that they've kind of it's been perpetrated on the individualistic societies, in the sense that then people believe the myth and seem to have a way of actually idolizing people that have succeeded, not realizing that it was the ecosystem that was in that actually provided them with the opportunity to be successful. So, I mean, that's just a couple of quick thoughts as to why maybe we don't have a real kind of a holistic approach when it comes to economics, is that the inability to reconcile it on a societal level.
Thank you, Joseph. James, and then Stephen. Go ahead, James, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Hey, thanks, Rick. Good to see you back. Would it be correct to associate mythos with the because mythos could be interpreted as kind of very untrue, right? Fantasy-like, but also mythos could be interpreted as deeply intuitive, right? And it could be more closer to what is instinctual and closer to what is most necessary in order to, survive and thrive in this world. And
yeah.
So intuition would be something opposed to this kind of even common sense, perhaps, calculative, scientific measurement and so forth. Intellectual, super intellectual, like, so logos would be associated with that, right? And yeah.
Yeah, this is we're at the key paragraph to address what you've just raised. This is you've brought us full circle from the sort of wide ranging to the specific. What is mythos? And of course, the whole time I was prepping for today's session, I was thinking about Sharon, because Sharon always asks these questions. What exactly does Kenneth mean by myth? And what is the value of myth? What is the practical value of myth? How does it serve us? And I think today we will get to the heart of this. Yeah. I think what we find here in this paragraph is a sequence where Kenneth has been somewhat more compressed than usual in his writing. And if we unpack it, we're going to find the core definition of what he thinks the mythic is and how it functions for us.
Right. Yeah, because animals and plants, are really instinctual. They don't, they don't need to, unconsciously calculate and measure and so forth. But they're doing what is necessary to survive. And for us humans, we're kind of like far removed from the instinctual, but we could, by intuition, maybe get back or remain, connected with that instinctual process that we need. And maybe the logos is taking us away from that instinctual aspect of ourselves. And maybe intuition is that bridge, that gets us, keeps us connected with what is natural.
Yeah, I'm going to unpack this for us today. This is I spent some time reading Goethe and Hegel and Schiller in preparation for today's session, because there's a lot in this. Stephen and then Phil, and then I'm going to take us to the text. Go ahead, Stephen.
Yeah, so I was just going to say, for all those, I spend a lot of time with Marxism, and for all those budding Marxists out there, I'd always say you really need to think about human nature, the fourth ape. And what I tend to notice about them, they're very competitive. At the moment, there's about 8 billion people on the planet, all competing for their little chunk of the earth. They're all rather similar, despite the idea people think we're all that different. So, yeah, please, all those Marxists out there, what are you going to do with the principle of savage competition, as Barbarella pointed out back in that movie from the 1960s? And when you're talking about logos culture, yeah, this is where Whitehead becomes interesting. You wouldn't imagine a mathematics guy would be practicing continental philosophy, but I haven't studied Kant too well, really. I'm going to have to one day, but he's critical of philosophy from the time of Kant and accuses that philosophy of having exiled reality. The ideas sound good. The idealism, yeah, it's not bad. But what happened to reality? Oh, we lost it on the road somewhere. And this is a very curious question, that we don't look at what reality is any longer. Everything has to conform to our set of ideals. And we really need to question that. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. Yeah, we're getting into this stuff. This is what today's going to dig into. Phil, go ahead, and then we'll go to the text.
Yeah, you don't have to wait to go to the text, because I'm going to take you right to it. Okay, like I think we're in F7. At least that's why I went. And actually, the first line, I'll quote it, then I'll give you my thoughts. In fact, I've written it down. Like the slow wheeling of constellations, Greek culture modulated from the archaic and poetic genius of myth into the rich polony of philosophical concepts and systems. So from a kind of like, I guess, kind of guessing, if you want to put it that way, into a kind of conceptual system. This is not my thought. This pinpoints the exact moment that philosophy came to be, at least that we know of. It was the moment after Parmenides, Heraclitus, Pythagoras, and the last Socrates. So Socrates was the kind of midpoint. He might be the tip of the spear, but he was still sort of like in between camps. To Plato and Aristotle, it was the two, they were the two that formed the foundations of philosophy and the concept of logos. But that is important to understand that the logos does not exactly mean logic as we think of it today. It would seem that of the two, Plato's logos was closer to logic, since it was driven by some sort of transcendental forms. Not necessarily transcendent, but the forms are inner driven by the recollection of a sort of geometry, which was within the inner soul's memory of the truth, of the real, not through the ambiguities of appearances. For Aristotle, the soul was a living substance emerged on earth, also an inner force driven by life's desire to continue to become itself, and thus a dynamic force that pushes itself into the telos, into the world. In many ways, this desire to continue to be means it must push beyond experiences to fulfill its destiny. It is a destiny of unfolding itself into the future. If being is, what is the meaning of being? In that we humans are thrown into existence. Is it to, as Plato, back to the future, to the original moment when the forms are pure and absolute? Or is it forward into the future in which a destiny is uncertain? I think that is why the notion of the evolution was such a earth-shaking moment in the history of thought. That was my entry into today's subject.
Thank you. Phil.
The more static mathematical purity of the soul, or the more living force of the soul that's still, I think Aristotle was still sort of like, although he's passed through it, he wanted to keep some attachment to the arche of the past. And Plato wanted to make as clean a break as possible. Cleaner than, by the way, Socrates. Socrates knew there was a soul. He wasn't quite certain where it actually stood. And so I think that Plato sort of like did harm to Socrates by freezing it down into a permanent form of dialogue. There's still interpretation, but Socrates always insists on, let's talk it through, because we don't know what the hell we're talking about. Okay, that's it.
Thanks, Phil. Yeah, there's a dynamic quality to Socrates' philosophy that one needs to experience. It's hard to read about it. You sort of need it to happen to you to fully get what he's up to. And that was what Kenneth used to try to do in his philosophy classes, is introduce the dynamic elements into the class, where he didn't rigidly impose a curriculum on the students, but would respond to what the students were talking about. You know, what did they bring up? What were their concerns? And then adapt the discussion to that. That flow of dialogue is pretty critical to Socrates. But let's go back a paragraph to this one that begins like a prehensile organ, and I'm gonna break apart the pieces in here, because I think the definition, Kenneth Smith's definition of myth and mythos, is right here, but it has to be unpacked. So we start with the prehensile organ. Is he just being poetic, or does he mean something specific? So first of all, the great thing about a prehensile tail is its mobility, right? Its ability to coil around and access things that a non-prehensile tail can't do. A non-prehensile tail can move a little bit, but can't pick things up, can't manipulate the environment. It lacks that extreme utility and involvement. And when he talks about myth as a prehensile organ, he's specifically evoking another discussion he's had elsewhere about the idea that learning to become philosophically self-aware is a counter-natural activity, that it's not normal for the range of the human mind, that it, left to its own devices, left to its defaults, says Kenneth Smith elsewhere, the human mind would never become philosophical. It has this tendency instead to adopt the patterns and perspectives of the culture that developed that mind, that it was acculturated within, and to just stick to them. And it might play within that framework, or it might be, rigid and frightened and try to hold still within that framework. And that might be, there's your liberals and conservatives, but both of them are equally bound within the frame. They take for granted an enormous number of assumptions that aren't even visible to them. He says, to learn to become philosophical, to learn to question your own mind, requires that the capabilities that you've been developing to allow you to manipulate a piece of wood or a hunk of clay, or to garden and grow tomatoes, you instead are applying to your own head. And it's harder because you can't touch it. It's not in front of you. It's not before you. In some sense, it's what's behind the eyes instead of what's in front of the eyes. And to turn the eyes around in their sockets to look back at the brain would be just as unnatural as what's required to think about your own character the way that you think about a garden or a brick wall that you're making. He said, the metaphor he uses, he says, it's so unnatural that it's like trying to get extra range of motion in your arm by dislocating your shoulder, so that now that it's dislocated, you can reach parts of your back you could never touch before. You know what I mean? There's a scene in the science fiction horror film. How am I drawing a blank again? It's the one on a planet where darkness falls and all the alien monsters come out and start eating everybody. And Vin Diesel is the star in it, and he has the ability to see in the dark, which gives him a special role. But there's a scene where he's been tied up, and in order to escape, he dislocates his own shoulder. And now that it's dislocated, he can move his arms, over through a gap that he couldn't reach otherwise. And this is the metaphor that Kenneth Smith uses for the pitch black. Thank you, pitch black. This is the metaphor that Kenneth Smith uses for the philosophical mind. He says effectively it has to dislocate itself, which you got to imagine is painful. It's uncomfortable. It's not natural. It's damaging in a way. One is put in mind of Nietzsche saying that philosophy is only for the healthy. The sick, it's only ever made sicker. It's dislocating your shoulder is not normally a smart thing to do. It's you're trying to avoid dislocating your shoulder. It's not meant to move that way. But once you've dislocated that organ of your mind, says Kenneth, it can now turn like an owl's head. It can turn a full 180 and look backwards upon itself in a way that you couldn't do before. Speaking of horror movies, The Exorcist, which is that 1970s roller coaster horror film that tried to scare people back to Catholic Church. It's got a scene where the little girl possessed by the devil, her head turns a full 180 to look at people and say scary things. And if you were raised in a religious upbringing, it's a really scary moment because the devil's doing this unnatural thing to her. But if you were raised as an atheist, it's hilarious because of course that could never happen. If somebody's head turns 180, they die. They've now died. At that moment, the movie's over. Oops, so too bad. The devil doesn't have any vehicle to work with anymore because the human neck doesn't work that way. It's one of the differences between us and an owl. And I emphasize that in order to suggest this sense of, how unreal, if you were watching a video and someone's head turns 180 degrees, even if you thought it was a real video up until that moment, the second you see that happening, and now it's not real. It's like, oh, that definitely didn't happen. Human heads don't do that. And he's trying to drive home the sense that philosophy is that unnatural for a human being. The human brain just doesn't do that unless it's been dislocated. And then it has this weird, unnatural range of motion. The other thing to think about this is that if a painful dislocation is involved in the development of philosophy and the philosophical mind, an analogy is birth. You might say, what sense would it make to put some vital function on the other side of some kind of physical catastrophe like dislocation? Well, you could say the same thing about a human birth. Our brains get so big, our heads get so big that human beings basically have to give birth to, they have to give birth early to infants that aren't fully developed. Because if they're fully developed, the head's too big to pass through the pelvis. And even so, even when the child is still smaller than a fully functioning child, even when the bones haven't fused yet along the sutures and they're still soft and the head can be squeezed into the shape that's required to get through, even so, it's this incredibly painful process. So evolution doesn't mind creating species in which to reach maturity, you have to go through a cataclysmic, painful process. We all do that when we're born, all of us. It's possible for something both to be necessary and the natural arc of development, but also to be so painful as to be in some ways unnatural and weird. And this is what he says about philosophy. So when he says it's a prehensile organ, he's definitely talking about that range of motion that's unexpected. And part of why this is weird, it goes deep into our hard coding, our genetic hard coding. To look at the self for the first time in the way that we've always looked at the other, the way we look at a brick or a lump of clay or a piece of wood, to see it as something outside of ourselves that we can impose our will upon, and our plans and our formal desire to, change the world to come into accordance with our designs, to instead look at yourself that way and see yourself as an other to be manipulated, is deeply unnatural. And one of the ways that can be indicated is that the evolution of multicellular organisms required that the genetic makeup of cells be changed such that cells stop attacking other cells. Up until that moment in their development, a cell might think of some other cell as a competitor. I will do better if you do worse. There's only one piece of food there to eat. I need to kill you and eat that food, or I need to get there first. There's this sense in which the other is a threat that's much stronger in single-celled organisms than it is in multicellular organisms. In fact, in multicellular organisms, we have had to develop this whole schema for recognizing that the other can be a self. The other cell in the body is still part of the same body. We have a larger sense of self. And that has to be so strong that it overcomes that desire to compete and destroy the competitor. If it doesn't, you get cancer, which is what my wife had, before, she got her last treatment on Wednesday. So hopefully we're done now. It's a major catastrophic illness to treat the self or parts of the self as though they're other. And it has been a catastrophic illness ever since the invention of multicellular creatures. That's how deeply it's wired in us not to look at ourselves as a thing to be manipulated. And this is what he means when he says philosophy is a deeply unnatural act. So that's the first bit. That's the bit about the prehensile organ. It says, like a prehensile organ, myth gathered into coherent handfuls the psychically colorful issues of human existence. I do love that expression, psychically colorful issues. He then says, it made it possible to think in terms of principles and concepts. And I need to break this down a little bit. So principles, let's talk about principles. And of course, by principles, we do not mean anything modern, right? To a modern, a principle could be anything. I did it for the principle of the thing means I had this idea and I thought, well, I think it's really stupid to do this thing I'm going to do, but the idea tells me to do it anyway, so I'm going to, right? The principle of the thing can be as ephemeral as I had some idea stuck in my head. An idée fiche is the French term for an idea you can't get out of your head, and so you just go along with it. We also use the term principles to mean almost anything else. A principle could be a pattern, a principle could be a rule. I mean, we don't really know what a principle is, and we don't really care. We care a lot about what a dollar is or a law, but we don't really we don't have a clear thought about what a principle is. We sort of summon up principles whenever we want to make ourselves feel noble or seem noble to other people. Then we say, oh, I didn't do it for merely practical reasons. I had principles. And it's like putting a crown on or a cape and pretending to be Superman. I dress up in principles long enough to win the argument, and then I put them down again and go back to my ordinary life when nobody's looking. But of course, that's not the way in which he means principles here. He means the Greek arche, principle, right? He's talking about those aspects of nature that are not on the surface of nature, but are underneath the surface of nature, that act as fountains of order and patterning that generates the patterns that we see in nature. Every tree, every cat, rainfall, every snowpack, every wave that crashes on a shore is not just a thing unto itself, but is also the expression of deeper principles of nature that are found throughout nature that saturate everything that's natural and help to explain why natural things unfold new order one way rather than another way. It's a deep subject, this issue of principles. It's when he says making it possible to think in terms of principles and concepts, what he's saying is that it doesn't come naturally to us. What comes naturally to us is to look out and see the tree or see the apple, to see the surface expression of the patterns of nature, and to assume that that's what nature is. Certainly that's how modernity takes it, right? We're interested in, how many cords of firewood, how many cubic yards of lumber. We want to know what the resources are, the things that are present in nature for us to build out of. And issues of why there's firewood, where wood comes from, things like that. We care a lot less about that. That's the concern of people whose job it is to make tree farms. For the rest of us, it's at most a hobby. Our legal system is not arranged in order to attend to the underlying principles of things. It entirely is focused on the surface phenomena of things. Did you commit a crime? Okay, well then this is the punishment that you get. The end. Now justice has been served. We sort of deal with these surface logical syllogisms based on the phenomena. The idea of any underlying principles, maybe legal theoreticians and philosophers might get into the principles, but everybody else has to pay attention to the letter of the law. I'm going to pause here for Sharon. I see you got something on your mind. Go ahead.
When I first read this, I thought that principles was a very odd word to apply to myth. In fact, it was completely out of character, because principles imply, in my mind, imply character. Myth doesn't imply character. Myth, I think, and we're living in a mythical time now, myth means that the individual or the society finds a way to acceptably explain and understand the social circumstances, given the context in which the society is currently operating. So when he says here, it made it possible to think in terms of principles and concepts. Concepts, yes, but principles, no, in my mind. So explanation, please.
Well,
I
yeah,
heard what you were just saying.
That's why this whole session is for you, Sharon. This whole session, as I was preparing for this, I thought, oh, Sharon's going to love this one, because I think this is the issue I've done the least good of a job of explaining for you out of what we've covered so far. The modern definition of a myth is a falsehood. It's a story that's untrue but widely accepted. That's what a myth is to us. But it's not what a myth is to the ancients. The word, the mytho, and myth is an ancient word. It's not our word. We're borrowing it. And from an ancient perspective, they would say we're misusing it. That our definition, we should have used some other word instead of the word myth. Because by myth, they mean one of the very most important things that it's possible to mean. And that's what we're going to talk about today. From the beginning to the end of this session, it's all going to be about using this paragraph to uncover what Kenneth says the ancients believed myth is.
But I also like the word prehensile, which I think is very comprehensive.
Yes.
Because it's a grasping. And in fact, I'm sorry for skipping along again, but the very last sentence of that paragraph where it says, myth is the most pivotal and vital step of the culture's learning to encompass the order that encompasses its feeling psyche, not its principled psyche, not its characterological psyche, its feeling psyche. And through myth, humans digest the ineffable to gain a waking knowledge of their own dream life. Those two last sentences, I think, sum it up. And I had a lot of conflict with the word principles, because a dream life is not a principle.
We're coming to that.
Okay.
You're asking the right questions. This whole session is about what you're asking.
Yeah.
I knew you were going to ask it. I was ready. I anticipated you, Sharon. This today is all for you.
Yeah.
But it's going to take the full 2 hour, 2.5 hours.
Yes. And I didn't think you guys were having it. I came back and I was surprised. I said, "Oh, they're having it. It's Labor Day. Good job."
Yeah, when you weren't here at first, I was like, "Oh no, I prepped this whole thing for Sharon."
Yeah, no. I came back. I said, "I gotta see it."
Anyway, I'm glad you came.
Yeah.
But yeah, give me another 2 hours and I'll be able to answer your question. I'm going to do this one step at a time.
Yeah.
One step at a time. But I think you'll be excited about the answer. It's pretty dramatic. There's a reason why he's associating principles and concepts with myth. And I think by the end, you'll know why. Phil and then Donald, and then we'll go back to the text. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I think what Sharon brought up is important. Between the principles and I guess the feeling psyche, the mythic psyche. I was reminded by Heidegger's concept of thrownness. We're thrown into the world. We don't know what the hell's going on. But we come to slowly understand it by interpreting it. What he said was, you don't suddenly, well, maybe you shouldn't put that always the case, but generally you don't suddenly come to an aha moment like, yes, now I understand. He says, when you understand is always already understood. In other words, like, yes, I'm in love with this girl. I didn't know it, but I've been in love with her for like 3 weeks. And now I suddenly know, because my feeling, like, and suddenly my consciousness said, oh God, like, God, I really care about this girl. It's like, so there's a feedback loop between the concept, the higher concept, and the mythic feeling, because I guess, so therefore, in a sense, he does say that sometimes you have to like be very careful, because this involves phenomenology in a way. You can't take something simply as it is. There's something deeper than that. But, like, so you say, oh, that's a tree. Well, you don't quite understand it. But as you do that, you say, oh, you get more and more depth and you understand it, what a tree is. And then you come to say, oh, I know what a tree is, but you've already known it was a tree. So something has to be given before you actually realize what the hell it is that's given. You can't just sort of like make it up like, oh, yes, trees. Right? So there's already a kind of interchange between existence and concepts. I mean, like, you can't just start out with concepts,
Right. Something
has been given to you, and then you create, what the hell was that now? And then you dig into it. Oh, that's a tree. Yes. And so right. Your mind is not separate from the world. I mean, it is there. Yeah. And only then when you're there that you realize you've always been there. Yeah. And it's always like popping up. It's, oh, that's how it became the unconscious to the subconscious to the conscious. Oh, God dang, I'm in love with this girl. I didn't even know it. So thank you, Sharon. I just wanted to underscore what she said. That's important.
Right. Thanks, Phil. Before I call on Donald, I'm gonna throw this little note in here about, what is the definition of a principle. Let's underscore it, and I'm underscoring it because it only makes Sharon's question clearer and more intense, which is, when you see what a principle means to the Greeks or to Kenneth Smith, it raises the question even more deeply about what on earth a myth could possibly have to do with one of these things, right? How is a false story that's popular in any way related to the fundamental sources of order in the cosmos? The two they're opposites, right? They're opposites. But the first step towards understanding that the ancient perspective and the modern perspective are completely alien from each other is to understand that to an ancient, they're not opposites. That in fact, a myth is the only vehicle for explaining principles. There is no other vehicle available to Homo sapiens, according to the ancients.
Well, Rick, let me interrupt just very briefly. Yes, they are the opposites, but that's like setting the table for the possibilities.
Yes. Yes, I'm underscoring in order to underscore the paradox at work here, which is that to a modern, a myth means something radically different from what it means to an ancient. To an ancient, most of what we call a myth would never be called a myth. You wouldn't call those things myths. That's insane. It's not a myth unless it is explaining principles. If it's not making concrete and unforgettable and emotionally engaging one of these deep sources of order so that we can never forget about it, and we'll always understand for the rest of our lives how that's important to us, how that principle matters. If it's not doing that, it's not a myth at all. That is to say, most of what we call myths in a modern sense are not myths in an ancient sense. It's the only way. And so it raises an enormous amount of confusion for us mentally, because I mean, the words don't match, the concepts don't match, the things that are being equated don't match. This is our sign that we're looking at an alien worldview, that an ancient is not just a primitive modern. It is an alternative to a modern. It's somebody who sees different parts of the world, and what they see, some of it might be worse. They might see some things worse, less well than we do, but they're going to see other things much better than we do. There's things that we see badly that they see clearly. And which is something we'll only be able to figure out by doing thorough comparisons between these worldviews. So as part of understanding how alien it is, it's this concept that to us, a myth is a disposable, funny thing. It's like, okay, he believes in a myth. But to the ancients, the myths were the very most important things and the only way that you could explain archai to people. It was the only chance you had. We'll get at why in a moment. That's what the rest of this 2 hours is about. Donald, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
On my mind, very little. Less every day. I wanted to say something now. Bill just leads me into wandering some places, but I've been reading a lot of Arendt, and somewhere what's stuck in my head is culture. Our culture is the stories we tell ourselves and our children. You know, and we can find out about ourselves by looking at our stories, the stories that we tell. I think as we describe the world to those newly entrants, ones newly entering it. But I also wanted to say more about this text here. Sharon really likes it when we talk about the text instead of just rambling like I was. That the principles have a lot to do. There was a quote, maybe something that Kenneth said. It could have not even been in this. It was maybe 2 years ago or whenever. That like philosophy is finding the principles behind or under or within appearances, something like that. And most recently, we've seen that when he referred to Nietzsche's great ad hominem, whatever. He didn't use the word great. But anyway, when we say it made it possible to think in terms of principles and concepts to modulate one's way out of merely personal or phenomenal ways of experiencing, I only have one thing there. Say auto genothi. We are initially to ourselves just an appearance with no depth. We have to come to an understanding of our own arche, the own principles that guide our own life. I mean, I'm almost convinced that philosophy is se auto genothi
all the way down, just like those Hindu turtles.
Yep.
You know. So enough. I that's my gift to Sharon.
Back to
You
the-
gotta tell me what is Alphi Ganosi though. I missed that. I don't understand.
Here it is. Ganothi, stay out, and
Yeah.
myself.
Know thyself.
That's
No.
that's what it says. It's one of the sayings on the
Oh.
entrance to the Oracle at Delphi.
Know thyself.
And it's the one Socrates went back to over and over, and Heraclitus went back to it over and over.
Yeah.
The Greeks, you know, it was a list of like 120 little truisms, and some of them really stand up, like nothing to excess or know thyself, and others like you should obey your mom and dad somehow didn't stick over the ages as being as profound. Although they're well repeated, they didn't strike people as being as deep and profound as know thyself did. So yeah, I think Socrates and Heraclitus would agree with Donald that all of philosophy is just unfolding the implications of, you know, effectively by putting it there, they were saying, oh, did you want to talk to the gods and get prophecies of the future? You shouldn't even bother until after you spend some time figuring out who is this you who wants to ask a question and what are the implications of that. You do better to start there. Was the implication. So principles, yes. Joseph, got your hand up. Go ahead.
Something interesting, and maybe I just want to. There's two things actually. I mean, maybe a better word for myth would be hypothesis in a way, to a certain degree. I think it tries to weave in a story, but it's, you know, kind of a idea of how the world works. But the other thing is that, you know, and I have not read Kant at all, and I just, you know, read it literally a few pages, and I was in a meetup yesterday about it. And the one thing that can come up is how essentially he essentially breaks from nature, and, you know, in a sense that this idea of the cause and effect throughout the universe, and that we're a result of that, and that's, you know, how we can break away from that, and we have this idea of free will within that, and so that our minds are able to you know, basically to, you know, figure out what reality, understand reality. But in a way, and he's discovering this, you know, he makes a lot of inferences from there, you know, as to what, you know, are analytic truths and synthetic truths, all, you know, kind of these all these inferences that we can make about the world. And it's interesting because it's a myth in a way, you know, and so he's using a myth to explain rationality, and so there's kind of that odd conflict. I would say it's a myth that we have, you know, that we're completely autonomous and kind of able to break away from our situations. So he comes up with this idea, this, you know, theory in the story, and says we can figure everything out rationally, and that seems to me to be a myth. It's kind of a contradiction in a way.
But it would seem to be a myth in the modern sense of the word myth, a falsehood.
Yeah, exactly.
But
yeah, so but
sense of
it
the word
was a
myth.
story. It was a story he told himself to explain a principle, you know, and it was something that but it shows you the, you know, myth, and I kind of alluded to this last time. They have, there's two sides to them. Sometimes they perpetrate a story that's, you know, that's untrue, and then they have a side that actually helps us explain and make sense of the world. And I think so I just find it to be interesting in the sense that, and that's why I thought the idea of hypothesis might be a little bit better.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
anyway, it's just a thought.
Thanks, Joseph. Yeah, it's natural. We struggle with this terminology, and Kenneth warned us we would. We start comparing across the boundaries between worldviews, and we find, as we were warned, every important term is loaded with a different set of assumptions across that boundary. And good to see you, Ginny. And any time that that we try to compare, we have to watch out for all of our important terms. We can't just take the term with one set of meanings across and try to use it on the other side of the worldview boundary, or else we're now saying the opposite of what that people meant. And it's confounding. I'll give you another example. I know myths is, this is a great term for really seeing the confusion at work, but I'm going to apply it to the word concepts too. Concept. And say that our initial reading of the word concept is also not what Kenneth meant and not what the ancients mean. And one of the ways that you see this is I mentioned before I embarked on translating Hegel's philosophy of Geist, his volume 3 of the Encyclopedia of Philosophical Sciences, into English. And part of what I'm doing in my translation is that I'm refusing to translate all of the terms. So where there is not an equivalent English term, I'm instead saying, let's go ahead and use Hegel's term, or in some cases, an ancient Greek term. So there's some German and some Greek in there. So we use terms like Geist and Begriff and Verstand. We use terms like Gnosis and Noesis. And the reason we use those terms is that any attempt to turn it into English muddies the waters about what Hegel's trying to say. Hegel meant these terms in very precise, crisp ways. And so whatever our translation says must be equally crisp and precise. It can't suddenly mean the opposite of what Hegel wrote, or else what we're reading isn't a genuine translation. It's just some other work of our own that we was inspired when by looking at Hegel. It's misleading rather than illuminating. So one of the critical things to note is that over and over and over in translating Hegel into English, they translate the word Begriff either into concept or notion. It depends on the translator which word they pick. They pick one or the other English word, and then every time that Begriff appears in Hegel, they cross it out and they put in concept, or they cross it out and put in notion. Neither of those words means anything like Begriff, and in many ways they mean the opposite of Begriff. And the result is you read these English translations supposedly of Hegel, and the sentences in some cases not only mean the opposite of what Hegel meant, but sometimes they just break down into gibberish and you have no idea what he's talking about. And it's because he didn't say any of that. That's what the translator said. So when we see the reference to concepts here, we have to remember that Kenneth Smith has spent an enormous amount of time reading Hegel and wrestling with these problems of translation. And the word concept, just like the word notion, is going to be a loaded term for Kenneth. He knows that concept is the usual translation of Begriff. Now, for in English, a concept could be very abstract. It might be a theorem, for example, or it might be a category, or it might just be some general notion. Any of those things could be a concept. But when we're translating Hegel, badly, but granted, when we're translating Hegel, a concept is the term that's used to mean a concrete, meaningful experience. The idea that we get in our head after having a concrete, meaningful experience is a Begriff. And it's in opposition to a Verstand, which is an empty, abstract idea, like a logical formalism or a category. That would be Verstand style thinking. Verstand is where we're doing logic and mathematics, and where we're sort of where lawyers think through the legal system, or what are you allowed to do or not allowed to do based on how we've categorized you and so forth. All that stuff, it's very empty, very divorced from reality. It's very pure and perfect and follows the rules, which is why we love it, but it has very little to do with reality. It's divorced. It's so abstract, and its connection to reality is tenuous, which is why there's so many miscarriages of justice. We catch somebody, we say, okay, you must be this kind of person, so we're going to impose this kind of sentence. And of course, they weren't that kind of person. We just put them in that category to justify what we wanted to do to them. And so now we're doing injustice, but by ignoring the miscategorization that we did at the beginning, we can call it justice instead and feel good about ourselves. So Verstand versus Begriff is this critical tension in all of Hegel's writings about the way the mind works. So if he's going to summon the term concept, especially if he's going to put it side by side with the term principle in this sentence, Kenneth is definitely meaning a begriff, a concrete, meaningful experience, not a general idea. Because principles in this context, in the ancient context, they're not abstract either. They're concrete, tangible, they're arche. They're concrete and tangible, but they're hidden underneath the surface of nature, right? Nothing is more meaningful or real than a principle. They're just hard to put your finger on. Like Heraclitus said, nature loves to hide. It's hard to get your hands around the principles, even though you can see the evidence of them everywhere. They're obviously there. They're obviously at work. It's just, it's hard to see them. So when you engage in thinking about principles, you're engaging in thinking at a deeper level than just the surfaces of things. And when you engage in thinking about concepts in the begriff sense of the word, which is what he means here, you're talking about collecting meaningful, concrete experiences, similar to what we mean by cosmopolitanism, going out and learning more about the world. Not going to, sitting in classes is nice, but literally going out and learning to do new things. Pick up a flute and try to play it. Go out and get your hands dirty in a garden. Go try to build a wall. Do things. Because nature will push back against your empty, abstract ideas by not obeying the way you thought it would. It's why med students are required to spend time actually in hospitals. It's like, yes, you sat through the classroom and you got an A, but what happens the first time you actually have to, put in a catheter yourself? Now the empty ideas are suddenly confronted with the reality of a human body in front of you with actual tangible needs, and it's not going to obey the way you thought it would, right? All that the ideas in the classroom learning were doing was getting you ready for the moment when you could genuinely learn through begriff. Begriff is where you knock the stupid ideas out of your head and you replace them with the tangible experience of reality, and that's when you become that's when you start really becoming a doctor, is hands-on. Which is why terrifyingly, why it's called medical practice. It's not until you practice it really starts to become real. And as a result, the longer you practice, the more real it becomes, the more you learn, the better you get. And all of your patients from your early days wish that they'd been able to see you in your later days after you've practiced longer and knew more. But that's how it goes. Sharon, go ahead. Tell us what's on your mind.
Well, Phil is always given his experience, so I'll talk a little bit about mine. You work in these organizations that have fairly well-defined mission, vision, and values. And in that whole triad, I think you live out mythos and logos, because I think concepts has a very strong political arm, and a principle is the fundamental of one of the fundamentals of philosophy for me. It's the highest good, highest knowledge, and the politics is the way the social organization behaves, right? And that is where the myth comes in. And the rest of it is the logos or the semi-logos. And when you're a leader sitting in a position where you have to make a decision, it becomes, somebody will always quarterback the decision the next day, right? And you have to steer in this very, very narrow concept, because the myth sometimes will take you to an area that's not ethical. And when it's not ethical and you lose your principles, then you're running in violation of your oath. And so this is why this always interests me, because organizations and medical organizations do live out myth, and the myth is very political. And so when you talk about concept, the concept that goes inside your head, when you say concept, concepts are political, because I've seen them change from day to day and from person to person. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, this is, again, we're running against the difference between ancient terminology and modern terminology.
Yes.
It's like everything that you say about a concept is true about a concept in the modern sense, but a concept in the ancient sense, none of that would be true. because the ancient concept of a concept is the actual tangible lived experience, which doesn't change from day to day. You know, it's why gardeners all have something to talk about together, because the longer you spend with your hands in the soil, the more the soil teaches you its lessons. You know, people who've been gardening for 40 years have what Hegel calls the Begriff of gardening. They've replaced the empty political Verstand of gardening, you know, what they might have learned from a book or a classroom or from arguing with people. They've replaced that with what it actually feels like to have your hands in the soil, and all, you know, the discovering, for example, that you don't make every plant happier by dousing it with as much water as possible. And when you're a beginning gardener, you might be so afraid of plants drying out that you drown them and they die. You know, and you're like, oh my God, I thought this was the way to take care of them, but it's not. The Begriff is displacing the Verstand, the lived experience. And then once you get to that level, you then get to the level of, well, some plants might like their roots wet and other plants can't stand to have their roots wet and will die if they're wet. And so now the Begriff gets richer, because it starts to get these details of, you know, not everything's the same. Everything has its own character and its own needs. And that's what's authoritative, not, you know, any general logic or theorems that we had. So there's this level at which learning to let the cosmos speak to us in however much detail is required to get that understanding, the concrete, tangible, real understanding, you know, of what we have to do to relate to it properly. This takes time. It takes practice, and it takes an ability to set aside the politics, right? Because if we insist on sticking with the politically popular idea, then that's going to be in opposition to learning the lesson the soil's trying to teach us. We'll be trying to suppress the evidence and going, no, I need to believe what my neighbor believes so that I get along with my neighbor. It's like, no, you need to believe what the tomato's trying to teach you. Right? And until you let the tomato teach you, you're going to be a bad tomato gardener. You just, at some point, you've got to listen to the damn tomato. It's got its lessons. So when he says effectively in the opening of this sentence, myth made it possible to think in terms of principles and concepts, there are at least three critical terms here that if we read them in the modern sense, the sentence is gibberish. Because it's like falsehoods make it possible to think in terms of airy generalizations and nonsense ideas that are politically popular, would be a modern reading of this phrase. But that's not what he means at all. He means what an ancient calls a myth, which is so different from what a modern calls a myth, is necessary if we're going to understand the deeper logic of nature. And also if we're going to understand how it is that our concrete, lived, meaningful experiences turn out to be expressions of these deeper principles underneath it. Every tree is exhibiting deeper principles that make trees possible. And the longer we work with our hands in the bark and the fruit and the soil, the more we begin to gradually work out, that's why this tree has to be like this. It doesn't just happen to have these properties. It needs to be like this. There is a layer of necessity in nature that has a structure and values that allow it to produce the variety that we see around us in nature the way that it does. You know, if I'm dropped into a land blindfolded and I take it off and I look around and I see a tree, for most moderns, all I see is a tree. But if I'm an indigenous person, or if I'm an arborist, if I'm somebody who specializes in trees, I'll see a specific species of tree. And this might be a species that only grows where there's water underground. So it could be a dry landscape, but if I see that tree and I have the proper Begriff, I don't just see a tree, I see water. I can dig and I can get the water. But I have to know the relationship. I have to know there is this deeper meaning to this specific species of tree and where and why it grows. And if I don't have that connection, then to me, it's just an empty abstraction. It's just a tree. You know what I mean? Or I'm thinking about it at a Verstand level instead of at a Begriff level. And because I'm not at a Begriff level, I've lost the connection to the deeper meaning of why this tree is here and what it could have to teach us. The same is true of some trees have very strong root systems that develop because they live in flood zones. And, you know, like in the Southwest, You see these old, dry, gnarly trees in arroyos, and their root structure is there because flash floods happen. And if I hear thunder in the distance in the southwest, and I'm standing in an arroyo and I look around and I see a bunch of these trees with these gnarly roots, I should get out of the arroyo and up onto high ground, because the flash flood might drop on me and kill me in seconds. But if I don't have the begriff, the lived experience, if all I have is empty ideas, then I look over at a tree and I just see a tree, and I don't know that it means there's a flood coming. Watch out. I'm detached from the principles. I'm detached from the way that the begriff ties us to principles and illuminates principles by illustrating them in a concrete, meaningful, tangible, important way. So what he's saying here is that myth in the ancient sense is an art form that was designed to use specific concrete details to illuminate deeper principles. If it's doing that, then it's a myth in the ancient sense. And if it's not doing that, then it's not a myth in the ancient sense. Not even if 8 billion people call it a myth, it's still not a myth. This is, again, a contra-modern idea. The modern idea is that people create reality. If 8 billion people vote for something, then that's how it is. If we all vote that the sky is purple, then now it's purple, whether it was or not. But to people more connected to nature, they understand that politics has a limited ability to shape reality. And that if they ever come into direct conflict, it's our ideas and our politics that have an obligation to change if we're supposed to survive. And thus, myth in the ancient sense is playing I don't even want to say prophylactic, I want to say a nutritional function for our minds. We need it to plug ourselves into these deeper principles, because a life lived disconnected from those principles is a life at risk. We're likely to step into traffic on a freeway. We're likely to walk off a cliff. If we don't understand the principles, then we don't yet understand what the big moving forces are that make up our life, and that both endanger us and provide us with opportunities. We're sort of blind to the things that matter. And that issue of blindness is going to come up in the rest of this paragraph repeatedly. Phil, and then we'll go ahead on the text.
Yeah, thanks a lot for explaining deeper the ancient notion of myth that's tied to the griff. That was important to understand the other dimension relationship to the abstraction. What led me to raise my hand was Donald's assertion. I don't think he's asserting that, but he's asserting it as a question. Is that, because we experience a world through a phenomena, that's our first impression of the world. I mean, it's like, so the phenomena always mediate between us and what things actually are. So given that, it becomes a problem because we don't actually ever have any direct experience of the actual world. Does not mediate it. I myself believe that the phenomena does have some, at least, direct connection, just not a complete connection. And given that, it does become problematic because it can become something where subjectivity is driven all the way down. I always sense that that's wrong, because I think that there is a world, there is otherness. The question becomes, to what degree and how do you embrace the world through the phenomena, and then be able to go into greater depth by experiencing it. And when you mentioned the griff, it just reminds me that, in a sense, it's a more direct experience, because it's kind of like it's there, it's ready at hand. You don't have to wait for it. You don't have to go to Home Depot and or some mail order and wait for the tool to help you mediate. It's already ready at hand right there. It's like, it's just present. So that's important. And I think now the question is that, because the cosmos is so huge, what do you choose to embrace? That introduced the notion of bias, right? If you're totally biased, then it's just totally subjective. It does go all the way down, right? Do you embrace living nature? I mean, and to what degree? I mean, first of all, do you embrace humanity? Okay. That seems like something that's closer. Is that too narrow of a sense? Or do you embrace living things? And do you embrace, differentiate between animal living things and plant living things? And do you embrace, is it fair to really think of yourself as a philosopher when you say, well, like the stars, like the planets a billion miles away, like, I don't know. I don't care. Or do you care? I don't know. I mean, how wrong is your brain? I think that it becomes somewhat of a semi-personal choice, how you draw that circle of what I call entanglement, right? How do you want to entangle? Because if you want to embrace the cosmos, you have precious little time to take care of the tomato plant. So I think freedom becomes one of choice, how you're going to draw the circle. How deep does it go down? And and even in terms of humanity, sometimes like, do you really want to embrace everybody? Because that's why that could become a tribal thing too. I mean, like, yeah, but I don't care about the Aborigines. Like, who cares? I mean, I think it all becomes a problem of how the circle is. And the broader your circle is, in a sense, the more comprehensive it is, but it's also more difficult. It also, in some sense, distances you from, your neighbor next door. For instance, I don't have time to talk to you now, Joe, because I gotta go look at the moon, whatever. So I think the choice then has become one of like how you choose to what degree you can embrace something and still have something that function for you in a way that involves your particular ethics.
Right.
And I think that's what it is. Otherwise, if you just embrace yourself, then in a sense you're not you're actually not connected to being. I mean, it's just like yourself. And then you just hope that things come, for you, and everything works,
Yes.
That's it. Phil, thanks a lot. And thanks for what you suggested, Donald, about going all the way down. I didn't like that. I mean, somewhere you have to stop somewhere.
Thanks, Phil. So let's hit this sentence two other ways. So he talks about, basically the understanding myth in the ancient sense also requires understanding what is it trying to get us out of? What are we stuck in that it's trying to help us overcome? It serves a specific purpose. Like eating protein serves a specific purpose for us biologically. The myth serves a certain purpose for us culturally in this ancient sense. So one of the two things that Kenneth is concerned about in this sentence is merely personal ways of experiencing. And by the merely personal, this kind of goes to what Phil was talking about a bit. Are we connected or disconnected from things? If we're too personally focused, then we have a parochial experience of the cosmos, in which it's too easy to assume there's nothing in the cosmos we haven't experienced already, that we've seen enough to understand what's possible. And in doing this, we make one of the classic blunders of a mortal, which is to forget that mortality isn't just about dying. That is to say, about having a finite lifespan. Mortality is also about having a finite intelligence. And that one of the most important parts of kind of moving in the direction of wisdom is beginning by understanding how far we have to go. that we're not already wise. In fact, it's better to summarize us as being fools. It's a part of being finite in an infinite cosmos is that we're missing almost everything that's happening. Part of having a limited number of senses when there's so much going on around us is that we miss almost everything that we're next to. I can't see the interactions of the quarks. I can't perceive in the upper or lower registers of the electromagnetic spectrum. I can't see the endless rain of massless particles through my body, that would allow me to see, the early history of the universe back behind all the galaxies blocking my view. I mean, there's all these ways in which to be mortal is to be parochial. And since we can't experience enough, connoisseurial ad hominem. Yeah, Bing Chat would not like the word connoisseurial. Always gets underlined. Is, are you sure you didn't misspell this? It's like, yeah, modern technology. I bet it doesn't like the word connoisseurial. So anyway, it's like we're not going to live long enough or experience enough to get out of the trap of parochialism. So we need a prosthesis to compensate for our parochialism, to help make up for it, to give us any shot at more comprehensive and deeper understanding of the world. And principles, archai, and concepts, begriffs, give us an opportunity to punch holes through that suffocating finite parochialism. But it requires us to learn to see past the surfaces of things, which we'll talk about next, and to see what's underneath them. And it requires us to punch through the envelope of places we've physically gone and the vast universe of places we haven't physically gone to kind of get some sense of what's out there without having to spend the time that we're never going to have to actually go there. I know things about France that don't come from direct experience because I mean, my whole experience of France was being at a Paris airport on the way to Jordan some years back. If I were relying entirely on begriff, I'd be screwed. I needed other sources of information to break down my parochialism. And myth is trying to do that at a fundamental level. All right, so merely personal, that's one of the concerns that he has here. The other concern he mentions here is the merely phenomenal ways of experiencing. And by merely phenomenal, now we're talking Kant and others. We're talking about the way that when we interact with nature, we interact with the surfaces of nature. I put this grape in my mouth. I have a phenomenal experience of grape plants, not a deep experience of grape plant. I don't have a single grape plant grow. I'm in Seattle. Grape plants don't grow all that well in Seattle. It can be done, but they don't grow all that well. So I don't have any in my garden. So the amount that I know about grapes as a plant, it's almost all abstract. And as a result, my actual experience of grapes is concerned with the phenomena, which is delicious, but it's shallow, right? And it reminds me of the kids in New York City who thought that milk comes from stores. They don't know that milk comes from cows and sheep and goats and other mammals. They're misunderstanding. They're mistaking the surface details of the fact that they go to the store to get the milk for the deeper meaning. And the deeper meaning is that milk does not come from stores. It has to be brought to the stores from where it really comes from. That depth is what principles are about. That's the level underneath the surfaces of things. If we want to be able to get that deeper meaning, we have to break out of this envelope of shallowness that we inhabit in our world. And this topic is entirely, Heraclitus writes about this a lot. Nature loves to hide. He's telling you the principles are under the surface, right? The hidden harmony is best. The Lord whose oracle is at Delphi neither reveals nor conceals, but gives signs. The finger pointing to the moon. This is all that stuff that says you have to use the phenomena that you experience as an opportunity to get past them to the deeper principles underneath, if you're going to have any chance of really living an adult life. The life that's so preoccupied with the surfaces of things, the life that's so preoccupied with the parochial experiences we've managed to move ourselves to, since we've been born, is the life of a child. It's so finite, it's so disconnected from the full scope of reality that it leaves us woefully unprepared to make decisions in an adult fashion. So this sentence is talking about breaking out of these problems. So, we're talking about trying to dilate the human mind to be able to reason not just about the finite things that we've directly experienced or are comfortable thinking about, and not just about the trivial infinities, like the set of integers that goes on forever, but can be summed up with a single equation, but to the complex infinities that life is made out of, right? That all living things are made of cells. There's an uncountable number of cells in even one living thing, multicellular organism, and every single cell is different. And every single cell is simultaneously changing, each in its own different way at the same time, making this an infinity of infinities of infinities. And that's the beginning point for life, is being able to deal with things that are too complex, and yet at the same time they're too complex to think about well, but they're too important not to think about well. You know what I mean? It's one of the fundamental paradoxes of human life, is that we have an obligation to do something that's outside of our capacity. And it's an impossible, unfair challenge, which is why we need a cheat. We need to stack the deck in our favor. And one of the ways that we stack the deck is by leaning on our begriff in order to extrapolate the deeper principles that point the way to the more general picture, without doing so in the empty way that Verstand prefers, doing so in a concrete way. How do you pit concrete, strongly reality-based experiences against expansive but empty and error-prone generalities in order to try to get a realistic picture of a larger cosmos, too large for us to understand, but that we have a duty to understand? How do you do that? Well, you do that through this medium of principles to which most forms of explanation are ill-suited. Logical syllogisms aren't going to teach you about principles. Math equations aren't going to teach you about principles. Laws aren't going to teach you about principles. None of this stuff is structured correctly to tell us what a principle is. Principles have a structure of their own that's very confusing for us to think about, because it's under the surface and because it's infinite. It affects everything, right? Gravity, everything's affected by gravity everywhere all the time, but that's a simple infinity. You can sum it up with equations. But life, the way that living things create a current in opposition to entropy, the way that instead of running down, they run up into more complex forms of order, this is mind-boggling for all of these finite-oriented modes of thinking. We need a different set of mental tools that can allow us to grasp the reality and the importance of these very strange, seemingly contranatural, let's at least say counterintuitive structures in the cosmos. This is what he's talking about in this sentence. That's what he's saying. When he says we need something to help us get past the merely personal and the merely phenomenal, this is what he means. Donald and then Phil. Go ahead, Donald.
What you just said in Stephen's little aide de memoire there, the connoisseurial ad hominem, what was so connoisseurial about that ad hominem was that it involved this backwards reasoning. You see the act and you can get to the desire that drove the act, the want or whatever. But that's also in showing itself in another way, in this way with phenomena, appearances, arguing backwards to arche. And that is what we do when we genothi seauton. We get from ourselves as we initially appear to ourselves to our true nature, going backwards, exploring ourselves. That's why I said it's not actually, Phil, it's not Genothe Seauton all the way down. It really stops when it hits us, but it starts outside us. And as we unravel questions of justice and beauty and truth and whatever, we generate these long chains of hypotheticals. And what ends the hypothetical? Well, we either know ourselves or we don't. We've gotten to human nature, to our own arches, or we haven't. And so in so many of like Plato's Socratic dialogues, people who haven't gotten there look at that and say, well, this dialogue didn't prove a thing. It's just a bunch of hypotheses that never go anywhere. Well, it's true. For some, they never will. They can't. But so I would say that this is kind of interesting that Kenneth is, you're existentialist or you're delusional, but existentialism also has here this phenomenological. That was sort of a part. Existentialism does study the phenomena, but not to examine closely their external appearance, but to derive the arche that generate those appearances. I hope I didn't upset you again, Phil.
Well, we'll soon find out because I'm going to call on him next. but I think it's worth saying, this is your analogy of saying from the begriff of tangible, concrete, meaningful experience, can we work backwards to the underlying principles, is the same kind of difficult and captious backward inference as is done to work backwards to figure out what somebody's character is like based on what they did. And in fact, it's not just a metaphor. It's precisely the same form of reasoning, and for precisely the same reason, which is that character is fate, says Heraclitus. Character is fate. Whether it's the character of an ecosystem or the character of a person, character is fate. And the reason it's fate is that character is made up structurally of archi, of principles. And those archi are fountains of order. And the tensions and interactions of the drives of those different competing fountains manifests into the specific details and properties of either a person and what they do or a tree and how it grows. It's the same thing. And this is why Heraclitus tries to get us on the right track early on by using the word character and nature for both of them. He says the nature around us and also the nature within us, the two infinities that we stand poised between. And so, of course, when you say it's not Genothe Seauton all the way down, because soon you get to the self and that's where it stops, Heraclitus's response is, yes, it stops on another infinity that goes down forever. He says, you couldn't find the limits of the soul even if you spent your whole life searching, such is its profundity. It's another deep subject. And for the same reason, archi are deep, they're infinities of this non-trivial fashion. And because they're that non-trivial form of infinity, their nature cannot be proven. No one will ever write a logical syllogism about a principle. In fact, one could argue one of the ways of telling that something is not a principle is if you can write a valid logical syllogism about it, you've just disproven it as a principle. It's some other kind of thing that we're just calling a principle. Because the only things you can conduct valid deductive logic about are things that are either finite or infinite in a trivial sense, like the set of integers. Whereas the deep principles of life are infinite in a non-trivial sense, an extraordinarily complicated sense, in which everything you say has to equivocate, to use Phil's favorite term. Between it both is and is not at the same time. We step and do not step. This is the struggle when you get down to the level of of these sorts of things. So we need a separate form of literature other than a law code or a math paper or a logical syllogism for explaining how principles work and how important they are. And it has to both make it possible for us to reason with them, and at the same time has to convince us emotionally of the importance of remembering them and paying attention to them, even though when we look around ourselves, they're invisible. We can't actually see them. We can only see the signature of them everywhere, of them affecting everything. Phil, go ahead.
All right, there you go. I thank you, Rick, for answering the self of Donald. That doesn't stop there. I mean, you answer it, even though you did use the name, you answer with Shakespeare. Really, I mean, that's the profundity of Shakespeare in relationship to philosophy. Okay, so, but I was concerned by your explanation of civilization, and I think it's a good fear because it's interesting. I've always thought that no, I want to be a civilized man, a cultured and civilized man. It seems like it's all for the good, it's positive. But you pointed out a very bad sign. In fact, it is true. Milk comes from the store. That's absolutely true. And culture is full of those truths that are not true. They are the ability of civilization to acculturate things by appropriating nature and redefining it into an object that is real to us, at least on the surface level, you know? And as long as civilization continues to function in its proper way, I don't have to know about cows. Yeah, milk. Go to the nearest S&P or whatever it is you go to. You get plenty of milk. It might cost more. So many objects that we appear in our reality of civilization is really an appropriation and a reification, that it is now ever more so complex that differs us from the real being of what things are. Okay. And so I was thinking as you were saying that, you know, now it struck me, I mean, I always liked that, but it struck me how deeply these urban gardens are to educate people who have no idea that the tomato did not come from the store. I mean, it gives them now like a little twist in the reality, like, oh yeah, there's another dimension that we did not see, you know? And the problem I see is that civilization has a good side. There's no question about it, but there's many good things. But we are so reliant on so many technocrats making the reification so real and so efficient that, you know, if we just bomb one of the tunnels that go from New York to New Jersey, we're screwed if you live in New York, right? I mean, like, it's we depend on the fact that things will remain efficient. Now we realize, no, how about that evergreen ship that got stuck in the Suez Canal? And there wasn't even a bomb.
That's right. Like, one mishap.
It was like, dang, it's like we have maybe misplaced or believe that civilization is good and it is good, but like it is very very vulnerable, and we depend on it because that is so real to us that I mean I dare say, including myself, if civilization went away, I wouldn't know exactly what to do. You know what I mean? Like,
No
it's
modern
like
would.
when it breaks down is when you find it come to reality. When it breaks down in a massive way, you really in reality. And even when the tornado comes, you know, the president's right there, you know, like
Yeah.
calming you and say, yeah, we will rebuild this. It's like somebody always said, how do we know you will rebuild this? You know, don't you have to fight a war somewhere?
How do we know
So-
you aren't just being generated by an AI?
Yeah, right. Exactly. So thank you for bringing up that aspect of civilization that we overlook, because everything is like, well, you know, it's easy, you know, we don't have to go out there and sweat. You just go and, you know, well, you have to sweat in, you know, in your factory, but beyond that, you just go to the store and everything is fine. And that is also generating that money. Everything is on that. Just one more thing. I remember when I was at Berkeley, I transferred there and I had to take a language, and I was very upset because I was not very good at it, and I complained to the dean. I guess the dean looked at my records, you know, and said, Phil, he actually said this. He says, Phil, I actually don't care if you don't take the language. Okay. Number one, I'm off the hook. Okay. Officially. However, you got to understand that at a university like Berkeley, one of the few tools we have in order to prevent students from becoming too parochial is to require them to take the language. I think he did not say it, but I think he hinted, it's not the language we're after. It's the fact that a different language puts you into the mindset of another culture, right? So he knew that I was diverse enough that I didn't require that. But I listened to him as that was the argument of civilization. And I sort of swallowed the thing, even though he gave me the way out. I said, thank you. I should have said, thank you, Dean. I'm out of here. But I took the fact that it was a very reasonable request, you know, do it for actually society as a whole. So I swallowed the thing and took a language, you know, in spite of the fact that I struggled in it. And so I think there's an interesting thing about the equivocation of like, yeah, do I like do something that's necessary for civilization and try to diminish parochialism, or do I say thank you very much, I'm out of here? So that's very interesting too. So okay, that's I want to say about parochialism and the problem with civilization.
Thanks, Phil. Yeah, so I'll call on Stephen in just a moment, but I don't want to lose this connection that we were building here, which is this idea that, you know, the proper conduct of life requires an understanding of these principles, and they're everywhere and they permeate everything, and they're all important, but they're also invisible. All we can see is the results of the principles at work. And because there's so many of them and they interact with each other, you often can't tell in a given situation which principles made that happen. It's certainly the same with scientific laws, that in any given situation, unless you're in a very carefully controlled laboratory, the odds are great that there's a whole bunch of different scientific laws that are all intersecting on the same situation and causing it to come out the way that it does. So there is this way in which, you know, how do you draw people's attention away from all the shiny, colorful, exciting things that they can see to something invisible that they can't see that's generating all those exciting, colorful, you know, interesting sounding things. And so there is this sense in which, you know, the Greeks and the ancients generally distinguished between the finite mortal realm, which they saw as, you know, I can't say profane, but I'm borrowing Mircea Eliade's terminology, the sacred and the profane. He wrote a book on the nature of religion. He wrote a lot of books on the nature of religion, but that one in particular tried to get at the heart of the difference between what's sacred and what's not. And, you know, from this ancient perspective, one of the critical issues is that the realm of the sacred involves capability, like the gods have capabilities we can never have, right? Apollo can reason about everything, and we can't. We can only reason about things that we've been directly exposed to, and only some of that. There's these limits. You know, Zeus can have authority over everything, whereas we can only have authority over the things within our circle of influence in our lives, you know, which for each of us is a different size and involves different things. There is this sense in which the realm of the profane is the realm of the finite, the human realm, and the realm of the sacred is the realm of these great infinities that affect everything. You don't have to be a theist to believe this. You know, it's just natural laws. The law of gravity doesn't live in Seattle exclusively the way I do. You know, my influence is mostly limited to where I'm sitting right now, and the law of gravity doesn't have that constraint that I have. Even though the law of gravity is a far cry from a genuine classical principle, it still hints at the larger realm of the sacred infinities. You know, like the way that life can organize things, can make them more organized than they were, which seems to defy the law of entropy. And it can do that everywhere, all over the cosmos at the same time. So how do you dilate a human mind, a mortal mind, so that it can begin to deal with the actual world, which is not just made up of the phenomenal surfaces of things, but is also made up of these deep invisible infinities that are creating everything? How do you dilate the mind to begin to care about those things when it's so easy to overlook them and ignore them? This is the purpose of myth in the ancient sense. It's if it's a myth, it's not just a handy explanation or a popular explanation, and it's certainly not a false explanation. It has to be true, and it has to be about these. It has to be true in a way that draws our attention from the concrete details we're familiar with in life to these deeper things that we're not as aware of, even though we experience them every day in our lives, because they're everywhere. They interpenetrate everything. You know, so the struggles of to have free will in a meaningful sense in a cosmos in which so many things seem fated is an example of we're dealing with the realm of principles here, right? How can Oedipus wander into this situation armed with his incredible intelligence and charisma, all of his gifts of character, but just not knowing enough about what's really going on? His only real vice is that he's a human being, that he's finite. He doesn't know everything. He doesn't know the full picture. And the pieces he's missing turn out to be the pieces that matter. And when he's missing those pieces, it doesn't matter how many other gifts he has. They all end up becoming vices. In fact, the structure of a tragedy is such that the greater your virtues, the more awful it will be when you enter the period of reversal, when all those virtues are working against you. If you were a mediocre person, you could never have an epic tragedy because your virtues were never great enough to turn into overpowering vices when you entered a period of reversal. But if you're an amazing, heroic person and you enter a situation of tragic reversal, then you know, all those gifts start working against you in a potent, powerful way. This quality of human life is something that we're all vulnerable to at some level. Hoist on our own petard, right? The law of unintended consequences, chickens coming home to roost. We're all aware of that in our lives. But this myth helps to draw our attention to it in a profound way. And that's why it exists. That's why Sophocles wrote it. And that's why he won that competition at that Olympic Games that year, because nobody did as powerful a job as he did of taking a pre-existing story and turning it into a really epic myth that draws our attention to these deeper principles. So this is the problem that myth is trying to solve in the ancient sense, that it's trying to give us an epiphany that we can go through in story form, such that having passed through the experience and come out the other side, we'll now look at the world and ourselves differently for the rest of our lives. If it does that, it's a myth. If it doesn't do that, it's not a myth. This doesn't make any sense using the modern terminology, but using the ancient terminology, that's what it means. Stephen and then Sharon. Go ahead, Stephen.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that whole business of a connoisseurial ad hominem. I was thinking we need the spicy version. We need something a little bit more Nietzschean in discussing this question. It's probably notable that Nietzsche's one of his biggest turnaround in life was Schopenhauer. Now, Schopenhauer was a sort, the young guy had come running in front of him and say, "Oh, I'm so happy. The most beautiful girl in the village is considered to be my wife." And Schopenhauer say, "Oh, I feel sorry for your tragedy." This is where Nietzsche thought, this is good. I've got to follow this guy for a while. He's and it's I really like, if there's anything you can give us, Rick, on this, some spicy stories about connoisseurial ad hominem, I'd like to hear them, please, if you've got a few minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. This is where I really need to David and I really need to convince Kenneth to come join, because he could rattle off some great connoisseurial ad hominems from the history of human civilization. It takes me longer to think about them and come up with them, but I'll work on it. Sharon, go ahead. What's on your mind?
One of the fascinating things about myth and this discussion is, even though in the ancient days, the establishment of myth formed the roots of modern ideology, one of the things I find today is it still exists and it's still operative, and it is morphed into something else. In fact, the third paragraph, and I'm sorry, but I'm ahead because I read, he says, "For myths are not arguments, and they do not explicitly or literally say what they're about, but only allude in a murky way." And we just don't have myths for the way we lead our lives. We have myths for societies. And I think if you study history, different societies have different mythological foundations, which allow them to have a particular kind of organization. And that's what I find, that this seems to me to be a continuously evolving process. And that's what makes it exciting.
Yeah, I agree. That's what makes it so interesting.
Interesting is a better word, I guess.
Yeah, no, I'm excited by it too, but I mean, it's kind of what draws us to it.
Yes.
There's so much to this.
Because it's a continuously evolutionary process, which with our social norms, our political norms, our scientific norms, as all those norms change, then the flavor of the myths change.
Yeah.
Because what we need to believe to ensure our existence changes.
That's right. And what the next level, right now we're working at the level of just bringing the ancient worldview into perspective, just trying to learn to see it and to see how it's different from ours. But where it's going to get interesting, and part of why he's got so many more chapters on the medieval worldview, is that he's not only going to show us the medieval worldview, but he's going to show it to us in a way that we can understand how and why it arose as a rejection of the ancient worldview. What was it they couldn't stand anymore about the ancient worldview that made them develop the medieval worldview as their negation of it, to say this is how we escape the trap of ancient Rome. You know, we do it this way. And it goes right to what you're saying, that you start to be able to see the evolution. Why did medievalism develop as a reaction to ancient, you know, the ancient perspective? And then that changes the way we look at modernity, because then we can start to see modernity as, why did modernity arise as a rejection of medievalism? And it's far more interesting than just, well, primitive things develop into mature things, and we're the most mature and they're more primitive, so of course we had to leave them because, you know, that was bad and we're good. But it turns into this rich thing of what exactly was wrong with medievalism that led people to negate it and come up with modernity. And then as we look back by the end of the book, from the perspective of modernity back to medievalism and back to the ancient worldview, having actually spent time in each one, they take on a whole new light now as not just being a root system, but being both alternatives to what we are doing now, and also I don't quite know how to say this, as being something we can be in a dialogue with, so that we can, use Phil's term, equivocate between the positions. And it gets really interesting, I think, but we're getting there. We're getting there. I'm still trying to pin down myth, and you know, we've got 50 minutes left to go. I think we're gonna get there. It's starting to come into focus. It's starting to come into focus. So we're working on this problem of the purpose of myth. That's baked into the sentence. And so, you know, one of the ideas that's here is that, why do we need a special tool to help us see principles? Why should that be necessary? Why can't we just directly perceive principles and learn to live in the real world the way that it actually operates? Why is that not possible? And, you know, it's because the way that we've evolved is to pass through a series of traps, just like the womb is a trap. And when we outgrow it, we have difficulty getting out of it. You know, the birth process is hard. You know, the head barely fits, and it doesn't go through without a lot of pain. And the same is true for the bud, the blossom, and the fruit that Hegel talks about when he talks about the development of the subjective mind, the Begriff-oriented mind. And then that becomes, that's what we're born into, the live wire experience, and how that becomes a trap that's difficult to escape into what he calls the objective mind, the intellectual life. And for most intellectuals, they think that's the end of the road. They think that it's what there is a choice of two ways of thinking, and that theirs is the good one, and that the subjective mind is the bad one. And so they get to be the rational ones, and the subjective people are condemned to being the irrational ones who will be scapegoated for everything that ever goes wrong. But, you know, Hegel's assessment is that Kant's wrong about this, and that the intellectual life is a second trap. It's a second stage of development. And the more we invest in it and get better at it and withdraw ourselves from the subjective world, the more we're stuck in this fake objectivity of empty abstractions. You might remember in previous weeks, I was questioning whether I was doing a good job using the terms Begriff, Verstand, and Vernunft for Hegel's three forms of mental development. But now that I've been going through doing the translation, it's clearer that they're the right terms. I lucked out. I was given the right terms to work with, because he talks a lot about the problems of Verstand, and he does it a lot not by saying, here's an essay on the problems of Verstand, but when he's explaining Begriff, he'll say Begriff is the antidote to this horrible Verstand problem. You know, it's just in passing. Verstand gets a rock thrown at it as a way of illuminating the value of Begriff, and it helps us to see that, yeah, there's this second trap. And so what we're supposed to do biologically as a species, our trick is that we're supposed to grow out of both of those traps and into the mature adult mind through another crisis. We have to pass through another constriction, another crisis, to develop the mythic mind. And this is a hugely different concept of myth than the modern concept. That the mythic mind is not some primitive form of science, and it's not some kind of love of fallacies, but it's what the adult human mind looks like. And the only reason we don't know that is that modernity as an epoch is devoted to preventing anybody from developing the mature adult mind. Because it's a lot easier to manipulate gullible people. So we're kept at the level of consumers and fans and producers and voters, and anything that's passive and ill-informed, that's where they want us, because then the ads work on us, you know, the political campaigns work on us, getting us to buy the new thing works. We're much more manipulable. It's easy to get us to do what people want if we're ill-informed and don't have a mature adult mind. But if we develop, you know, the heuristic mind, the mythic mind, then we'll tend to be not only resistant to PR and ad campaigns and so on, we'll tend to want to dismantle them and try to make a healthier world. And that's a disruptive influence. Modernity's trick for survival has been to conduct, according to Kenneth Smith, Donald will recognize this term, characterological genocide, to eliminate the development of the mature adult mind. So what he's describing here is this idea that these two stages of development, the dualic stage of the feeling life, the immersive, experiential, parochial feeling life, and then the banausic stage of the intellectual life, the ideological life, suckered by theorems and laws and systems, and being interested in maximizing for climbing those systems and rising to the top. These are both so powerful as stages of development that it's a natural tendency for us to abort our further development and not go any further. And for that reason, we need a powerful emotional, intellectual lever to help lever people out of being stuck, like forceps for giving birth, to help turn the head just so to pass through the difficult passage into adulthood that most of us never get to, or maybe none of us ever gets to, depending on Kenneth Smith's analysis. We might all be stuck at the previous level. Sharon, go ahead. You got another comment.
I really am intrigued by the question you just asked, the issue you just raised, the function of myth. Because as I was reading this, one of the things that I came to believe is that, and Phil alludes to this quite often, reality is hard. Reality takes character to accept and act on. Myth does not. It's easier to deal with a myth. And he says it here, and he says it in the 1, 2, 3, the fourth paragraph. He said, "Yet the age of myths fed the moral, religious, and political sanctity of the whole person, and I also advocate of the whole society." Because if you didn't place myths in your society, and I live in the state of Florida, and the governor had just said that, you know, slavery was a jobs training program, you know, that's a myth. But that's what he actually believes. And that's because he wants to change, he wants to rewrite history, right? And here he says, the new logos culture appealed to the intellect only. And those concepts is not appealing to the intellect, right? It's appealing to something that's emotional, right? And it's narrow vocabulary of forms and definitions. And so the function of myth is to keep a society in its place, or an individual in its place. I want to hear what you think about that.
So I think you've put your finger on what myth has turned into in the modern world. That's the kind of myths we have. They're sort of, from an ancient perspective, what we have is an anti-myth, right? Our anti-myths are designed to perpetuate a stasis and to keep there from being any disruption. The myth of the self-made man helps to keep people from organizing, right? No need to work together. I just pull myself up by my own bootstraps, not understanding that the phrase pull himself up by his own bootstraps was originally a satirical phrase. Like, nobody can pull themselves up by their own bootstraps. But now we think it's literally true and you're supposed to do that, and that's normal. And so that encourages us not to work together and instead to just, turn and compete with each other and assume that that's the natural way of things. when the truth is a mix, right? This Heraclitus's line is always people are trying to simplify things, oversimplify things to be one or the other of a set of choices. But what we see in nature is that nature creates its systems by harnessing opposites together into a dynamic system that has the qualities of both opposites at the same time. It's why we're walking on a foundation of paradox in nature, because Homo sapiens is not merely competitive and Homo sapiens is not merely cooperative. We're both at the same time. And an effective culture is one that harnesses those drives together in a way that allows the culture to thrive and the people to thrive. And a dysfunctional culture is one that pushes too far one way or the other way, pits one against the other, or waters them both down so that we end up with mediocrity. So from an ancient perspective, what we call a myth is an anti-myth, which is a concept we don't even have. We have no such concept. Kenneth Smith, in some of his other books, otherwise, and I think particularly in Webb's, has essays where he talks about anti-culture, anti-time, anti-mind, and he says it's difficult for a modern to understand what we would look like to an ancient, but from an ancient perspective, most of our institutions seem to be designed to do the opposite of what they were originally invented to do. So, is the purpose of government to ensure that everybody gets life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? Or is it to ensure that hardly anybody gets that? That a few people get it at the expense of everybody else through the suppression? Or in a really dysfunctional sense, is it so that nobody gets what they want and everybody gets some kind of gray porridge compromise? But in all of these cases, it's a breakdown of the original purpose of government from an ancient perspective. Aristotle would point at what we call democracy and claim is the worst of all governments except for all others. We say it's actually the best, but we like to pat ourselves on the head in a disingenuous way. And he would say, how come you call that democracy? That's what I would have called mobocracy. To be a democracy, you'd have to have shared principles. You'd have to be aligned on why you're together and be trying to make a better world together. If all you're doing is voting, that's on his list of the worst of all possible governments. But for us, we erase the distinction and we don't talk about that. And we say that democracy is one man, one vote. And therefore, the whole question of principles is erased from the picture. And we can claim that what we have, which Aristotle would have called among the worst forms of government, is somehow the same as what he was calling the best. There's this trick that modernity does over and over and over, where the point of the thing, the principle that's at stake, is erased from consideration, and you're left with the empty form instead. And so as long as you're just comparing the empty form, it seems to be the same. It's like cheese product instead of cheese, or artificial sweetener instead of fruit, right? It's like my tongue feels sweet, but I'm not actually getting any nourishment from this thing. So why am I calling it food? This is the ancient critique of what moderns call our myths. That our myths serve functions, but they're not health-giving functions the way that the ancient myths were health-giving. Our myths almost seem to serve the opposite function, like you said, to create conditions of perpetual stasis, to prevent us from intervening to make things better, to teach us to be passive, to teach us that nothing can be better than this, and if we ever ask for anything more, well, then we're hopeless utopians who think that everything will be perfect someday. Critiquing what's wrong gets equated with crazy idealism to the point that everybody's discouraged from trying to make anything better. Because if you try to do anything, well, then you're a crazy person. I don't know if I'm fully knitting this together, but there is this way in which, oh, good, okay. Yeah, if you stand with a foot in both worlds and you say, here's the ancient definition, here's the modern definition, you compare them point by point, it makes you crazy because they're clearly two different things that serve two different functions, and yet we've got the same word for both of them. And go ahead, Sharon, I'm going to call on you first as follow-up.
Well,
sorry, go ahead. I put you on mute by accident. You got to come off mute. I put you on mute by accident.
I wanted to make this point because I'm reading a book now called And There Was Light, and it's written by John Meacham. And the book starts with the second inauguration of Abraham Lincoln, 1865, 1867. And this kind of ties all of this together when we talk about principles and concepts and myth and how you can use principles and concepts in a half-hearted manner, or you can apply them partially. So from my reading the first and second chapters, Abraham Lincoln believed that slavery was morally wrong. And that was the basic concepts on which he did, he wanted to have the 13th Amendment and the Emancipation Proclamation, but he didn't believe that Black people had the right to vote. He didn't believe that we should intermarry. He believed in segregation. So even though he had a principle which he partially based on his religious foundation, Micah verse 6, do justice, right? The rest of it didn't follow. And I think this is the best example, as I'm sitting here listening to you, this is the best example of what you're talking about. The partiality of it, the principles and concepts, which are not really principles and concepts, or they're partially principles and concepts, and their application, their partial application does produce some amount of social discord.
Yes.
And individual discord also.
Yes. That's a great example. Lincoln is a great example because, this is Aristotle's take on tragedy. That first of all, it's not a tragedy if it's an ordinary person or a bad person. It's only tragedy if it's a good person. They have to have promise. It's somebody full of promise who most illuminates the nature of tragedy. Because when you see how, despite having so many virtues to work with, it was the ones they were missing that defined the story. That's when we begin to understand how complicated this business of life is. It's not enough to get some of it right. We got to get all of it right. Whatever we don't get right is going to be the part that defines the story. So here's Lincoln, who for many modern Americans is seen as a champion of equality. But when you actually read his writings, it turns out he's not. That wasn't the problem. That wasn't his problem with slavery. It's like, he's not the guy we think he is. And he's not as good a guy as we think he is, despite having done this good thing. He ends up being, for us, increasingly defined by the things he failed to understand. It's the same with Jefferson. All men are created equal, he writes, while keeping a sex slave prisoner in his basement. It's like, you want to admire the good parts, but then you find the bad parts. You're like, Jesus Christ, this is just as defining of the man as the good parts are.
Well, John Meacham makes the point that if Abraham Lincoln wasn't killed by Booth, then his evolution might have come to the point where his principles and concepts, right, might have welded together.
Yeah.
And been for the good of the whole. But we would never know because he got killed.
Yeah.
And he makes the concept that he was evolving. And which is why I tell you, I think mythos, and logos, as we explored to some extent, is such an exciting part of this whole essay to be, because it's evolutionary, because we're human and it's the way we live and it's the way we adapt.
That's right. That's right. Thanks, Sharon. I'm going to call on Phil and then we'll go back to the text.
Yeah, I think a myth is greater than a singularity of even any great individual. I was reminded by this. I think I mentioned this the last time we had a meeting in Thomas Jefferson's memorial. There was two walls that he wrote description. The first wall, the positive wall, was the Declaration of Independence. That was a great achievement, no doubt. But Thomas Jefferson, despite his flaws, was honest enough. Maybe he didn't actually do it. Maybe just people who honor him did it. In the back wall, on the other wall, was the fact that someday God will punish us for what we failed to do. Essentially, that's what it says. In other words, that was a confession that he did not live up to what his promise was. The fact that he was honest enough to put that in his memorial, it's an important thing to say that. Well, I don't want to excuse by saying we're all human. That's a little too simplistic. But the fact is that we are flawed individuals, and and that there needs to be a degree of forgiveness, not totally so, but I mean, the fact that he was able to confess was an important thing. The reason why I mentioned is not the singularity, is because the myth runs deeper, because it's really a collective kind of unconscious. And I wonder whether myth is not a kind of somewhat nebulous, somewhat ambiguous undercurrent that rise above the rational construct of civilization. And what that does is, if that's true, is that it is able to transition from one epoch to another epoch somewhat by providing a even grounding, so it's a transitional thing. The reason why I asked this, I kept thinking through my mind, like, where in history was there really a true late, I mean, in a grand scale, I don't mean in a small scale, but in a grand scale, a true late hard break, like right. Nothing like it was before, right? I think that would be almost incomprehensible and catastrophic. And I can't find it. And Hegel kind of has it right in the sense that myth allows the rational part to sublate, not eliminate, but sublate the other part. So it doesn't disappear. It persists as a thing that maybe eventually will fade away. So there's a smoother transition, so you don't get into a cliff and fall apart. So I'm thinking of, the Bronze Age collapse, maybe one, maybe you could say, well, the Greek culture did arise out of that. Who knows? I don't know if that's true. And I can't think of any in which there's really a hard break, like you just fell off a cliff, like the thing they, tell about, what is it? Skynet kind of thing, I think maybe the closer we come to, and that's not even in a grand scale, but maybe closest to, is a colonial culture that just completely eliminated, right? What could we learn from such a culture that was just completely truncated, like, the American Indians, or, particularly South America, that's completely obliterated by another culture, just lay over it, didn't sublate it, just sort of submerged it altogether. Maybe in Africa, even, like, what does the dominant culture, the colonializers, when they leave, have less left to imprint, but have destroyed the traditional myth enough that it's hard to recuperate. And you find those cultures having a lot of trouble trying to adjust, right? Because they didn't have that smooth transition. Suddenly they're left with, like, the parallax, of the culture. They didn't totally understand. They were just subjugated. And on the other hand, the original myth was somewhat decimated. And maybe that'll give us a clue. And I'm interested as they come up, like some of the native people, the Native Americans are beginning to be in universities, and they're beginning to try to recuperate their culture. I want to see how they could recuperate, and not only recuperate, but contribute to our understanding, because they were so eliminated. As I said, when I was at a graduate school, one American Indian tribe had to come into the anthropology museum to learn how to basket weave. Like, they do not know what the hell their culture was. They had to learn it from an anthropologist. I mean, that is terrible, right? So I'll just leave it at that. Like, because I think it's important to know that the myth, if that's the case, if a myth is really true, it may be not true totally, but it's true enough to sustain a culture. So when something new comes along, it could transition without being totally disrupted. That's it, Phil.
Thanks, Phil. Go ahead, Sharon.
I just wanted to say this. This is the gift of having lived in more than one culture, and I've traveled extensively. Colonialism eradicates the culture of the colonized. And what emerges is something that's totally different. It's neither the culture of the colonizer or the original culture. It's a mixture. And there, I can tell you, I'm Jamaican, you've detected that. It's extremely, extremely unique. That's one thing. And I can tell you that whether you're colonized by the French, the British, the Spanish, all those colonized have different mythos and different logos. And I can tell you that from having lived in my own and from having traveled and seen what other the things that other cultures have adapted. I remember when I was in Peru, the Incas, for the most part, resisted the Spaniards, right? And that's why Machu Picchu today is still standing. They built it before and they protected it fiercely. But then you get and you meet the people, and the pride are the mosquitoes. The people, I don't think I'm saying it correctly, the people who are part Indian and part European.
Mestizos.
What is this?
Mestizos.
Mestizos. That's the pride of that culture, and that's the myth, right? So what I'm saying is colonization, the British, and I'm partial to this, what the British left when they left the territories was a system. I am well educated because that's what they left us, right? They left us a system that worked. But you get into the French culture and you look at Haiti and it's chaos. You go to Africa and you look at where the Belgians were and it's chaos. So what I'm saying, it's the myth that undergirded the cultures when it became operative had a significant impact on the people. The other thing that I read in that book, which I'm finding so fascinating, is the different reasons for ending slavery. In America, it was probably because it was immoral. In Britain, it was also because it was immoral. But what they did is they paid the slave owners, right? Not the enslaved. They paid the slave owners. And John Meacham in his book alleged that they finally finished paying the financial instruments for slavery that ended 150 years ago. They finally finished paying the remunerations that they paid the slave owners in 2015. And I was shocked at that.
Yeah, Haiti's still paying France.
That's right.
That's why they're poor.
Yeah, that's why they will never get out until they stop that collection. So what I'm saying is, to your question, Phil, the way the culture emerges, or the way the country emerges after colonization, depends on what the colonizers leave, which is the mythos. It's primarily mythos, and not so much logos. I don't know if I'm making sense of this. It's something I thought about based on my own culture and based on what I see as I go around the world.
Thanks, Sharon. Much appreciated. Stephen, and then we'll go back to the text. Go ahead, Stephen.
Yeah, so as regards standing all your heroes of the past, I just read Birth of Tragedy a few years ago. And one of the things that struck me when you got so many pages in was Nishi was warning about that attitude that the modern liberal socialists, or whatever you like to call them, has inherited the asceticism of the church. They got rid of the church, but they've maintained the same values. And he said, that's the trouble with modern thought, that their truths have to be as pure as the whites of snow. He goes on to point out again and again that what has created value in human history wasn't pure. He points out astrology created the Egyptian civilization. We laugh at astrology, we call it nonsense, but it created the alchemists, those idiots, those imbeciles, laid the foundation of modern chemistry. He goes to point out this, that these ascetics are going to be dangerous, absolutely dangerous. But Nietzsche said, "Oh, well, I'm an optimist. I think the world has enough resources and humanity has enough resources that will survive after a great deal of death, the modern liberal, the purist, the aesthetic." Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, it's one of the most unthinkable things to a modern is that we're effectively a mutant medieval. That an enormous amount of our framework for understanding the world is medievalism. We call it modernism because we removed a few things and changed a few things, but the rest of it's all just pretty much straight up medievalism. And we deny that to ourselves, and as a result, we don't know ourselves. Gnothi seaut, and we don't do that. But the desire for purity and perfection, that's all medievalism. That all comes out of, purifying the spirit to be worthy of God. But when you remove God from the picture, but you keep purification, what is it that you're left able to purify? Well, that's where you get genocide in Germany. We need to purify the race. We don't have a spirit to purify anymore, so let's purify the body. We'll get rid of all the impure genetics, and next thing you know, you've got people murdering people. It's the same impulse. The same impulse that leads Torquemada to do inquisitions and burnings is the same thing that leads, to... And an ancient would have looked at both the medieval impulse for purity and the modern impulse for purity aghast. Like, they didn't think they were pure. They didn't try to make anything pure. They didn't see nature as being a domain of pure things. So, I think you're right, Stephen. There's an enormous amount of unexamined assumptions that people take for granted in the modern world as though it is perfectly logical and reasonable that they should want these things and do these things, when in fact they don't know why they're wanting or doing those things. We're back to Socrates, right? The unexamined life is not worth living for people. So clearly I'm not going to make it all the way through my analysis of this paragraph, but let's see how much more we can get done. The next thing to talk about here is his phrase, the mythic mind. In the next sentence, he talks about the mythic mind. That's not just a turn of phrase. He's not just saying when a mind likes myths or is addicted to myths or engages in myths. That's not what he's saying at all. This is an allusion to the idea that there are different faculties of the mind, like Hegel and Schiller and others have laid out, and that Hegel identifies at least 3 faculties. One we're born with, one many of us can develop out of the first faculty, and a third faculty that almost nobody develops because modernity suppresses it. Although Hegel wasn't the one who added the theory about suppression, that came later. But that third faculty is what Kenneth Smith is referring to as the mythic mind when he talks about this. He's talking about Vernunft. He's talking about the heuristic within us. And that what the heuristic is a desire to escape the traps of the parochial experiential mind on the one hand, and the abstracting, overreaching, formalizing mind on the other. That they're both traps, and to get out of them, you have to pit them against each other. That's where you get the juice, the leverage, is by pitting logos against experience. And out of those two, you're then able to rise up to a new level of thinking, which we have the capacity for, even if most of us don't develop it, which is what he calls the mythic mind, the mythic faculty. And the mythic faculty is the level at which you are able to, unlike Verstand, you're able to pay close attention to the begriff of your life. If you're an anesthesiologist, you don't just erase all of your tangible hands-on experience of what that's like in order to fit yourself into an ideology. You let that experience, that concrete experience of being involved in anesthesiology, inform your deeper understanding of life. You search it for the deeper principles about, human nature and how people can get along together and so forth, like running an anesthesiology team. Again, hands-on experience doing that, you're going to learn these lessons about how people can and can't get along together from trying to manage an anesthesiology team. And you don't draw those ideas about how people get along from nowhere or just from some abstract theory. You draw them from the hands-on experience of your life, because you recognize that that's where the real juice is. That's where the closest connection to reality is the thing that you spent some depth on. Phil, his experience in art, which he's devoted so much time to, is where he's going to be drawing a lot of lessons. Not all of them by any means, but the place where you go into depth, that's the place where you've got more begriff, and where you've got more begriff, you've got more of the juice of reality in your thinking. So that's where you should be looking for principles. Where we make a mistake is, as intellectuals, if we try to look for the principles of life in our abstract ideologies, which are disconnected from tangible experience. That's when we start, as Hannah Arendt says, that's when we start accidentally designing totalitarian systems and carrying out terrible programs, because all we have is the logic and we don't have the tangible experience to counteract the logic with. And therefore we become prisoners of our logic. And it makes us be willing to, we feel like we have to, it's terrible, but we have to do it because the logic tells us to. There's all kinds of mistakes that somebody who never engaged in anesthesiology would make in designing an anesthesiology program that Sharon would never make, because she's got the real life experience of being an anesthesiologist. It's all kinds of mistakes. She just knows better. Her begriff just warns her off of all kinds of false paths. Now, somebody who comes along with zero anesthesia experience, no hands-on at all, but who's otherwise the smartest person in the world, could be smarter than all of us put together, would still be a train wreck of a person to design an anesthesia department. They lack the begriff. So this is the thing about the mythic mind. The mythic mind is needed to escape the intellectual mind by using the real juice of experience to disrupt the assumptions of the ideology and logic and break out of it. It's when you wield both the feeling mind and the intellectual mind harnessed together in what Philip Rieff called the feeling intellect that you enter the realm of the mythic mind. That's what the mythic faculty is. The mythic faculty is not about lying to ourselves. That's the modern redefinition of myth. The mythic faculty is about how to use as much begriff as possible to triangulate on what the principles most likely are that are at stake underneath those concrete experiences we lived. And you see how this is different from cherry picking. Cherry picking is where you start with the ideology and you want to prove that it's true, so you go sifting amongst the evidence and you ignore all the evidence that suggests you're wrong, and you pick out the handful of things that seem to suggest you're right, and then you organize them into a little logical argument. See, I'm right because look at this one case over here, so therefore I'm right. This is not the mythic mind at work. This is the intellectual. This is the logos mind at work, which wants to believe that logic is enough and that you just use the bare minimum of evidence and you disregard and suppress all evidence to the contrary. That's what an intellectual does. That's the logos mind. But the mythic mind says, I've learned of the trap of the intellectual mind. I've learned of the trap of my own logic. I've learned the trap of desiring an ideological outcome. So I'm going to use as much real world experience as I can to search for ways to disprove my favorite ideas. And after I've knocked down as much of that garbage from my mind as possible, whatever's left, as Sherlock Holmes said, however improbable, must be actually pointing the way towards the truth. And now I can use those juicy experiences to illuminate that deeper principle that I've sort of found by process of elimination, so that other people don't have to go through the same life experience that I went through, so it can be communicated to others. So there's this issue, right? There's this issue that the feeling part of our mind, the experiential part of our mind, wants to make an envelope and make it seem like that's enough and that you don't need the intellectual part of your mind. And the intellectual part of your mind wants to create an envelope and make it seem like logic is enough and you don't need the feeling part. Each one wants to be the master and make the other one be subordinate to it. And because you aren't either one, you're the whole package. What it means is these two modes of thought are not just trying to suppress the other mode of thought, they're suppressing you as a whole person and trying to make you a symptom of that style of thinking. They're trying to make you into an intellectual or into, you know, a sensual, live for the moment person. They're each distorting you in their own image. And the mythic mind is the place where we try to break out of that flatland of one or the other to try to live a complete life that includes both faculties, even though they contradict each other a lot, in order to give us a better chance of connecting to the depth and breadth of reality, to make us pay attention to the things that matter. This is the function of the mythic mind. And in other places, I think even earlier in this book, but certainly in other books, Kenneth Smith has talked about the idea that this is the purpose of aristoi within a culture. Their job is to try to find ways to explain to people how reality really works and how we can relate to it. Even if that involves shaking up the status quo, we're searching for the most authentic, healthy life possible for people and trying to communicate it to others. And I say we, but none of us is actually an Aristos. We're all just fumbling at it. We're trying. I saw you came off mute, Sharon. Did you have something you wanted to add before I call on Phil?
Yeah, I wanted to add, I wanted to ask a question because I think the ancients, the Greeks thought that the aristocrats were the ones who were best suited to govern. And does it mean that aristocracy was less likely to engage in mythical behavior?
So the trick is they didn't want the aristocrats to be in charge. They wanted the aristoi to be in charge.
Aristoi, okay.
Because this is another place where Aristotle distinguishes two forms of government.
Uh-huh.
They're both rules by a minority. But in the case of an aristocracy, that's where the aristoi are in charge. But if you don't have aristoi in charge, if you have douloi or banausoi and they're just calling themselves aristoi, then it's not an aristocracy, it's an oligarchy. And he says, you know, an aristocracy is one of the best forms of government, but an oligarchy is one of the worst.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, he's ad hominem in exactly the way the modern world won't allow you to do. And he's saying it matters who it is up there who's governing. If it's somebody who is willing to challenge all of their own parochialisms and all of their own ideologies and in the search for the truth, then they're an aristos, and that's somebody you might want to have governing. But anybody else, they're not an aristos. And that means if you give them power, they're just going to use it to try to carry out their appetites and ideologies, which is a disaster for everybody.
So when I first immigrated, one of the things that really, really surprised me was that anybody could be president.
Right. Right.
Whereas where I came from, you had to have some governmental experience.
Right.
To be president.
Basic requirements.
Right.
Have you ever governed anything in your life? You know, why isn't that on the list of requirements for president? I mean, I'm not asking for much, but have you even governed, you know, a club?
Yeah, and in my mid to late 20s, I thought this was just fascinating. So when Ronald Reagan, who was governor of California, became president, I watched him with a great deal of interest. Not politics either way, but just to see his governing philosophy and how his values, the value system he had acquired over his life, had informed that.
Yeah. Yep, U.S. politics is certainly something to watch.
Yes, yes. And it's in a very interesting phase now, I think.
Yes. Like the Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times. Thanks, Sharon. I'm going to call on Phil. And Stephen. Go ahead, Phil. What's on your mind?
I wouldn't exactly call it interesting. I call it dancing on the margins. In any event, you know, the problem of the high and low is that particularly when you have a civilization where you have buildings that's over 100 stories high, you need the interaction. You need an elevator that both goes both up and comes down. I mean, if it just doesn't work if you just have an elevator that goes up and an escalator that goes up, but it doesn't
Forever.
come down, you know, or vice versa. You know, it's
Purity, man. We got to be pure. Only up.
right. So I think that in the communication between the up and down is kind of important. I learned this lesson actually by reading Robert Tubman's The Guns of August about World War One. There was a conflict between the Central High Command. You know how the Germans are. They're very, very analytical and very whatever. And they had a plan before World War One where they're going to just sweep through, you know, the Low Country into France and so forth. And it was so exact, it couldn't possibly be wrong. Because they have accounted for, I was surprised this, before the war, they had accounted for every boxcar in Germany, how it was going to move the goods and so forth. It was exhausting. And when the war began, and somewhere along the line, you know, the field general was saying, you know, like, it's not happening the way we wanted to. We got to change our plans, right? And of course, the high commander said, it can't possibly be wrong.
The plan is perfect.
Because we accounted for everything already. And so I think that lack of communication between the you know, the autocracy and the people on the ground is a kind of interesting one. And I just recently heard this thing about the Russians army. I was literally shocked. I was surprised. I'm not absolutely sure it's true, but I think it is true. They had no sergeants in the army. No linking individual between the command and the people on the ground. No wonder there's a problem, because they have to always wait till things go up to the high command to get the signal. And like, there's no people on the ground can't make a decision except, you know, Prigozhin. He'll make his decision. That's why he you know, he you know, erupted into a whatever, you know, invasion of Russia. And so, like, so that's interesting. I think you have to relate from up to the down. And I think we are in our civilization now developing, there's not enough at least distribution, let alone a communication between the regular people and upstairs. They might not know what the hell's going on. Either that or they don't care, or one or the other. So I think the interrelationship that flows in the communication is important, because you need to create that feedback loop. Always, what's on the ground is going to help inform what the structure is going to be. And without that, it's like it just remain like we must be right. It can't happen this way. We
logic is so
compute
compelling.
everything. Right?
Our reasons are so
how they were
good.
talking in that German accent.
Yes.
Okay, so that was a interesting insight. Like, yes, listen to the people, at least to some degree. All right, that's it. Phil.
Go ahead, Stephen.
I was just going to say, I remember Henry VIII got Defender of the Faith from the Pope for burning heretics. And then I checked up the number of heretics he burned throughout his 30-year reign, 12. And you get Defender of the Faith for 12. And I was thinking about the Enlightenment, that, you know, they were going to destroy the ancient regime, that despotism, that evil despotism. And the Enlightenment they overturn the ancient regime and they establish the reign of terror in 1 year. They persecute and kill as many people as it took the ancient regime 300 years to do. If I had a choice between the two, I might go for the ancient regime. Please.
I know, right?
Thank you.
Isn't this supposed to be a great march of progress? So I'll just wrap up with this. I've been throwing sentences in here that I wrote in preparation for this. These aren't Kenneth's sentences. These are mine, but I'm just extrapolating on what he wrote. So this idea is that the mythic mind is devoted to searching for these penetrating explanations of reality and putting them into the most rhetorically persuasive way possible to help people remember to look below the surfaces of things, to try to get a deeper understanding of the world that they live in, and that it has to be done in such an emotionally compelling way that it ruptures these membranes that otherwise completely enclose one of the two traps we get stuck in. And if it can't do that, then we remain infantilized lifelong. But if it can do that, in fact, it's supposed to do that we've evolved. We didn't just evolve these two traps, we also evolved the potential for this third faculty. It's clear that, once you study the whole structure of this Hegelian, Smithian, ancient Greek conception of the human mind and maturation, you can see how it fits within an evolutionary framework to say all of these downsides of the dualic or banausic traps within people, the tendencies to become one or the other, the damage is much alleviated if you've also got a third class that's arising. If a certain number of people are able to break through and develop the mythic mind so that they can share their insights with others, then as we saw, a doulos could be a fairly wise doulos, a banausos could be a fairly wise banausos, all things considered. They could be more or they could be better or worse, depending on how much of a seasoning of sort of ideologically rupturing myths they're exposed to that might help them to plug into reality better. It's just because these are tendencies in people doesn't mean it's absolute with exactly how it's going to come out. It really depends on this additional seasoning that we're clearly meant to have as a species, which, as we're going to see over the course of this book, really calls into question the modern project to try to suppress the development of any Aristoi. It's like, now we're doing something evolution never prepared us for. What happens when it's just the two, with the one exploiting the other? Go ahead, Sharon, what's on your mind?
Well, this is really exciting for me because, in fact, I read this whole chapter here, this whole subchapter here. And one of the things that I can't wait for you to discuss is the way myth and its implementation impacts the development of character, societal character, individual character, and class. And class is not an American concept, I have to tell you, right? But character is. I come from a culture where class is a heavy concept, So I just can't wait to see how we explore that philosophically.
Well, now that Beverly's through her chemo, we'll find out in 3 weeks if it did the job.
Please give her my regards, too.
I will.
I say a prayer for her.
She really appreciates hearing that. But it means we can stay on a weekly schedule indefinitely now, and I think we'll make some fast progress now through this really rich.
Because this is absolutely fascinating. Because I think that this, for me, of the 5, should I say, ladders, rungs of philosophy, I think this for me is one of the more interesting ones because it's operative, because I can see it. That's why I think we're living in interesting times, and how much denial, because I think people absolutely believe some of the things they believe with all sincerity.
Yeah.
And you must respect and honor that, and so it's just interesting to see the evolution of this culture.
Yeah.
Here we are. Slavery is a jobs training program. I never thought I'd hear that.
God help us.
Yes.
And on that charming note, we'll call this a wrap for this week.
Okay. See you next week.
No, I got to make one more comment. If slavery is a job training program, we need to expand slavery.
He didn't what he produced. It produced me, right, Phil?
What?
You know, after listening to Sharon today, I'm going to go back and rethink 1066 and what the Normans did. I didn't realize I was a victim of a French invader.
Well, you know, if slavery is a job training program, then I guess that means during the French Revolution, all that chopping off of heads, they were just freeing minds.
That's right.
Freeing minds.
As they rolled away.
Okay, Donald. Yeah, we're both from English ancestry. We'll start a class action against the royal family for what the Normans did.
That's right.
Yes,
This is your fault.
Yes. I mean, this is where the culture is. You know, I went, wow.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
wow. You know.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks a lot, guys. It's been
All right, bye-bye.
it's been good.
Bye-bye. Very
At least
good.
after
Bye-bye.
after
Thank
2
you.
weeks,
Thank you, Rick.
whatever. All right. Bye
Bye-bye.
bye.